Chapter 17 of The Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 17. Quote, I guess, by all this quaint array, the burghers hold their sports to-day. Unquote, by Scott. The ancient amusement of shooting the Christmas turkey is one of the few sports that the settlers of a new country seldom or never neglect to observe. It was connected with the daily practices of a people who often laid aside the axe or the scythe to seize the rifle, as the deer glided through the forest they were felling, or the bear entered their rough meadows to scent the air of a clearing, and to scan with a look of sagacity the progress of the invader. On the present occasion, the usual amusement of the day had been a little hastened, in order to allow a fair opportunity to Mr. Grant, whose exhibition was not less a treat to the young sportsmen than the one which engaged their present attention. The owner of the birds was a free black, who had prepared for the occasion a collection of game that was admirably qualified to inflame the appetite of an epicure, and was well adapted to the means and skill of the different competitors, who were of all ages. He had offered the younger and more humble marksmen divers birds of an inferior quality, and some shooting had already taken place, much to the pecuniary advantage of the sable owner of the game. The order of the sports was extremely simple and well understood. The bird was fastened by a string to the stump of a large pine, the side of which, toward the point where the marksmen were placed, had been flattened with an axe, in order that it might serve the purpose of a target, by which the merit of each individual might be ascertained. The distance between the stump and the shooting stand was 100 measured yards, a foot more or a foot less being thought an invasion of the right of one of the parties. The negro affixed his own price to every bird, and the terms of the chance; but when these were once established, he was obliged, by the strict principles of public justice that prevailed in the country, to admit any adventurer who might offer. The throng consisted of some 20 or 30 young men, most of whom had rifles, and a collection of boys in the village. The little urchins, clad in coarse but warm garments, stood gathered around the more distinguished marksmen, with their hands stuck under their waistbands, listening eagerly to the boastful stories of skill that had been exhibited on former occasions, and were already emulating in their hearts these wonderful deeds of gunnery. The chief speaker was the man who had been mentioned by Natty as Billy Kirby. The fellow, whose occupation, when he did labor, was that of clearing lands or chopping jobs, was of great stature, and carried in his very air the index of his character. He was a noisy, boisterous, reckless lad, whose good-natured eye contradicted the bluntness and bullying tenor of his speech. For weeks he would lounge around the taverns of the county, in a state of perfect idleness, or doing small jobs for his liquor and his meals, and cavilling with applicants about the prices of his labor, frequently preferring idleness to an abatement of a little of his independence, or a cent in his wages. But when these embarrassing points were satisfactorily arranged, he would shoulder his axe and rifle, slip his arms through the straps of his pack, and enter the woods with the tread of a Hercules. His first object was to learn his limits, round which he would pace occasionally, freshening, with a blow of his axe, the marks on the boundary trees, and then he would proceed with an air of great deliberation to the centre of his premises, and, throwing aside his superfluous garments, measure with a knowing eye one or two of the nearest trees that were towering apparently into the very clouds as he gazed upward. Commonly selecting one of the most noble for the first trial of his power, he would approach it with a listless air, whistling a low tune, and wielding his axe with a certain flourish, not unlike the salutes of a fencing master, he would strike a light blow into the bark, and measure his distance. The pause that followed was ominous of the fall of the forest which had flourished there for centuries. The heavy and brisk blows that he struck were soon succeeded by the thundering report of the tree, as it came, first cracking and threatening with the separation of its own last ligaments, then threshing and tearing with its branches the tops of its surrounding brethren, and finally meeting the ground with a shock but little inferior to an earthquake. From that moment the sounds of the axe were ceaseless, while the failing of the trees was like a distant cannonading, and the daylight broke into the depths of the woods with the suddenness of a winter morning. For days, weeks, nay, months, Bill Kirby would toil with an ardor that evinced his native spirit, and with an effect that seemed magical, until, his chopping being ended, his stentorian lungs could be heard emitting sounds as he called to his patient oxen, which rang through the hills like cries of an alarm. He had been often heard on a midsummer evening, a long mile across the vale of Templeton, when the echoes from the mountains would take up his cries until they died away in the feeble sounds from the distant rocks that overhung the lake. His piles, or, to use the language of the country, his logging ended, with a dispatch that could only accompany his dexterity and Herculean strength, the jobber would collect together his implements of labor, light the heaps of lumber, and march away under the blaze of the prostrate forest, like the conqueror of some city, who, having first prevailed over his adversary, applies the torch as the finishing blow to his conquest. For a long time Billy Kirby would then be seen sauntering around the taverns, the rider of scrub races, the bully of cockfights, and not infrequently the hero of such sports as the one in hand. Between him and the Leatherstocking there had long existed a jealous rivalry on the point of skill with the rifle. Notwithstanding the long practice of Natty, it was commonly supposed that the steady nerves and the quick eye of the woodchopper rendered him his equal. The competition had, however, been confined hitherto to boasting, and comparisons made from their success in various hunting excursions; but this was the first time they had ever come in open collision. A good deal of higgling about the price of the choicest bird had taken place between Billy Kirby and its owner before Natty and his companions rejoined the sportsmen. It had, however, been settled at 1 shilling a shot, which was the highest sum ever extracted. Footnote: before the Revolution, each province had its own money of account, though neither coined any but copper pieces. In New York the Spanish dollar was divided into 8 shillings, each of the value of a fraction more than 6 pence sterling. At present the Union has provided a decimal system, with coins to represent it." Unquote. The black, taking care to protect himself from losses as much as possible by the conditions of the sport, the turkey was already fastened at the mark, but its body was entirely hid by the surrounding snow, nothing being visible but its red swelling head and its long neck. If the bird was injured by any bullet that struck below the snow, it was to continue the property of its present owner; but if a feather was touched in a visible part, the animal became the prize of the successful adventurer. These terms were loudly proclaimed by the negro, who was seated in the snow in a somewhat hazardous vicinity to his favorite bird, when Elizabeth and her cousin approached the noisy sportsman. The sounds of mirth and contention sensibly lowered at this unexpected visit; but, after a moment's pause, the curious interest exhibited in the face of the young lady, together with her smiling air, restored the freedom of the morning, though it was somewhat chastened, both in language and vehemence, by the presence of such a spectator. "Stand out the way there, boys!" cried the woodchopper, who was placing himself at the shooting point. "Stand out the way, you little rascals, or I'll shoot you through. Now, Brom, take leave of your turkey." "Stop!" cried the young hunter. "I am a candidate for a chance. Here is my shilling, Brom. I wish to shoot too." "You may wish it in welcome," cried Kirby; "but if I ruffle the gobbler's feathers, how are you to get it? Is money so plenty in your deerskin pocket that you pay for a chance that you may never have?" "You know, sir, how plenty money is in my pocket," said the youth fiercely. "Here is my shilling, Brom, and I claim a right to shoot." "Don't be crabbed, my boy," said the other, who was coolly fixing his flint. "They say you have a hole in your left shoulder yourself, so I think Brom may give you a fire for half price. It will take a keen one to hit that bird, I can tell you, my lad, even if I give you a chance, which is what I have no mind to do." "Don't be boasting, Billy Kirby," said Natty, throwing the breech of his rifle into the snow, and leaning on its barrel. "You'll get but one shot at the creature; for if the lad misses his aim, which wouldn't be a wonder if he did, with his arms so stiff and sore, you'll find a good piece and an old eye coming arter you. Maybe it's time that I can't shoot as I used to could, but 100 yards is a short distance for a long rifle." "What, old Leatherstocking, are you out this morning?" cried his reckless opponent. "Well, fair play's a jewel. I've the lead of you, old fellow, so here goes for a dry throat or a good dinner." The countenance of the negro evinced not only all the interest which his pecuniary adventure might occasion, but also the keen excitement that the sport produced in the others, though with a very different wish as to the result. While the wood chopper was slowly and steadily raising his rifle, he bawled: "Fair play, Billy Kirby, stand back, make 'em stand back, boys, give a nigger fair play, poss up, gobbler, shake a head, fool, don't you see 'em taking aim?" These cries, which were intended as much to distract the attention of the marksman as for anything else, were fruitless. The nerves of the wood chopper were not so easily shaken, and he took his aim with the utmost deliberation. Stillness prevailed for a moment, and he fired. The head of the turkey was seen to dash on one side, and its wings were spread in momentarily fluttering; but it settled itself down calmly into its bed of snow, and glanced its eyes uneasily around. For a time, long enough to draw a deep breath, not a sound was heard. The silence was then broken by the noises of the negro, who laughed and shook his body with all kinds of antics, rolling over in the snow in the excess of delight. "Well done, gobbler!" he cried, jumping up and affecting to embrace his bird. "I tell 'em to poss up, and you see 'em dodge. Give another shilling, Billy, and have another shot." "No, the shot is mine," said the young hunter. "You have my money already. Leave the mark, and let me try my luck." "Ah, it's but money thrown away, lad," said Leatherstocking. "A turkey's head and neck is but a small mark for a new hand and a lame shoulder. You'd best let me take the fire, and maybe we can make some settlement with the lady about the bird." "The chance is mine," said the young hunter. "Clear the ground, that I may take it." The discussions and disputes concerning the last shot were now abating, it having been determined that if the turkey's head had been anywhere but just where it was at that moment, the bird must certainly have been killed. There was not much excitement produced by the preparations of the youth, who proceeded in a hurried manner to take his aim, and was in the act of pulling the trigger when he was stopped by Natty. "Your hand shakes, lad," he said, "and you seem over eager. Bullet wounds are apt to weaken flesh, and to my judgment you'll not shoot so well as in common. If you fire, you should shoot quick before there is time to shake off the aim." "Fair play!" again shouted the negro. "Fair play, gib a nigger fair play. What right at Nat Bumpo advise a young man? Let him shoot clear a ground." The youth fired with great rapidity, but no motion was made by the turkey, and when the examiners for the ball returned from the mark, they declared that he had missed the stump. Elizabeth observed the change in his countenance, and could not help feeling surprise that one so evidently superior to his companions should feel a trifling loss so sensibly. but her own champion was now preparing to enter the list. The mirth of Brom, who had been again excited, though in a much smaller degree than before, by the failure of the second adventurer, vanished the instant Natty took his stand. His skin became mottled with large brown spots that fearfully sullied the luster of his native ebony, while his enormous lips gradually compressed around two rows of ivory that had hitherto been shining in his visage like pearls set in jet. His nostrils, at all times the most conspicuous feature of his face, dilated until they covered the greater part of the diameter of his countenance, while his brown and bony hands unconsciously grasped the snow crust near him, the excitement of the moment completely overcoming his native dread of cold. While these indications of apprehension were exhibited in the sable owner of the turkey, the man who gave rise to this extraordinary emotion was as calm and collected as if there was not to be a single spectator of his skill. "I was down in the Dutch settlements on the Schoharie," said Natty, carefully removing the leather guard from the lock of his rifle, "just before the breaking out of the last war, and there was a shooting match among the boys, so I took a hand. I think it opened a good many Dutch eyes that day when I won the powder horn, 3 bars of lead, and a pound of as good powder as ever flashed in pan. Lord! how they did swear in German! They did tell me of one drunken Dutchman who said he'd have the life of me before I got back to the lake again; but if he had put his rifle to his shoulder with evil intent, God would have punished him for it; and even if the Lord didn't, and he had missed his aim, I know one that would have given him as good as he sent, and better too, if good shooting could come into the count." By this time the old hunter was ready for his business, and throwing his right leg far behind him, and stretching his left arm along the barrel of his piece, he raised it toward the bird. Every eye glanced rapidly for the marksman to the mark, but at the moment when each ear was expecting the report of the rifle, they were disappointed by the ticking sound of the flint. "A snap! A snap!" shouted the negro, springing from his crouching posture like a madman before his bird. "A snap good as fire! Natty Bumppo gun the snap! Natty Bumppo miss a turkey!" "Natty Bumppo hit a nigger," said the indignant old hunter, "if you don't get out of the way, Brom. It's contrary to the reason of the thing, boy, that a snap should count for a fire when one is nothing more than a firestone striking a steel pan, and the other is sudden death. So get out of my way, boy, and let me show Billy Kirby how to shoot a Christmas turkey." "Give a nigger fair play!" cried the black, who continued resolutely to maintain his post, and making an appeal to the justice of his auditors, which the degraded condition of his caste so naturally suggested. "Everybody know dat snap is good as fire. Leave it to Massa Joan. Leave it to lady." "Sartain," said the wood chopper. "It's the law of the game in this part of the country, Leatherstocking. If you fire again, you must pay up the other shilling. I believe I'll try luck once more myself. So, Brom, here's my money, and I take the next fire." "It is likely you know the laws of the woods better than I do, Billy Kirby," returned Natty. "You come in with the settlers with an ox goad in your hand, and I come in with moccasins on my feet, and with a good rifle on my shoulder, so long back as afore the old war. Which is likely to know the best? I so no man need tell me that snapping is as good a firing when I pull the trigger." "Leave it to Massa Joan," said the alarmed negro. "He know eberything." This appeal to the knowledge of Richard was too flattering to be unheeded. He therefore advanced a little from the spot whither the delicacy of Elizabeth had induced her to withdraw, and gave the following opinion with the gravity that the subject and his own rank demanded. "There seems to be a difference in opinion," he said, "on the subject of Nathaniel Bumppo's right to shoot at Abraham Freeborn's turkey, without the said Nathaniel paying 1 shilling for the privilege." The fact was too evident to be denied, and after pausing a moment, that the audience might digest his premises, Richard proceeded. "It seems proper that I should decide this question, as I am bound to preserve the peace of the country, and men with deadly weapons in their hands
should not be heedlessly left to contention and their own malignant passions. It appears that there was no agreement, either in writing or in words, on the disputed point. Therefore, we must reason from analogy, which is, as it were, comparing one thing with another. Now, in duels where both parties shoot, it is generally the rule that a snap is a fire; and if such is the rule, where the party has a right to fire back again, it seems to me unreasonable to say that a man may stand snapping at a defenseless turkey all day. I, therefore, am of the opinion that Nathaniel Bumppo has lost his chance, and must pay another shilling before he renews his right."
As this opinion came from so high a quarter, and was delivered with effect, it silenced all murmurs, for the whole of the spectators had begun to take sides with great warmth, except from the Leatherstocking himself. "I think Miss Elizabeth's thoughts should be taken," said Natty. "I've known the squaws give very good counsel when the Indians had been dumbfounded. If she says that I ought to lose, I agree to give it up." "Then I adjudge you to be the loser for this time," said Miss Temple; "but pay your money and renew your chance, unless Bourne will sell me the bird for $1. I will give him the money, and save the life of the poor victim." This proposition was evidently but little relished by any of the listeners. Even the negro, feeling the evil excitement of the chances, in the meanwhile, as Billy Kirby was preparing himself for another shot. Natty left the stand with an extremely dissatisfied manner, muttering, "There hasn't been such a good thing as a flint sold at the foot of the lake since the Indian traders used to come to the country; and if a body should go into the flats along the streams and the hills to hunt for such a thing, it's 10 to 1 but they will be all covered up with the plow. Hi ho! It seems to me that just as the game grows scarce, and everybody wants the best ammunition to get a livelihood, everything that's bad falls on him like a judgment. But I'll change the stone, for Billy Kirby hasn't had the eye for such a mark, I know." The wood chopper seemed now entirely sensible that his reputation depended on his care, nor did he neglect any means to insure success. He drew up his rifle and renewed his aim again and again, still appearing reluctant to fire. No shout was heard from even Brom during these portentous movements, until Kirby discharged the piece with the same want of success as before. Then, indeed, the shouts of the negro rang through the bushes, and sounded among the trees of the neighboring forest like the outcries of a tribe of Indians. He laughed, rolling his head first on one side and then on the other, until nature seemed exhausted with mirth. He danced until his legs were wearied with motion in the snow, and, in short, he exhibited all that violence of joy that characterizes the mirth of a thoughtless negro. The wood chopper had exerted all his art, and felt a proportionate degree of disappointment at the failure. He first examined the bird with the utmost attention, and more than once suggested that he had touched its feathers; but the voice of the multitude was against him, for it felt disposed to listen to the often repeated cries of the black to "give a nigger fair play." Finding it impossible to make out a title to the bird, Kirby turned fiercely to the black and said, "Shut your oven, you crow! Where is the man that can hit a turkey's head at 100 yards? I was a fool for trying. You needn't make an uproar like Falling Pine Tree about it. Show me the man who can do it." "Look this way, Billy Kirby," said Leatherstocking, "and let them clear the mark, and I'll show you a man who's made better shots afore now, and that when he's been hard pressed by the savages and wild beasts." "Perhaps there is one of those rights come before ours, Leatherstocking," said Miss Temple. "If so, we will waive our privilege." "If it be me that you have reference to," said the young hunter, "I shall decline another chance. My shoulder is yet weak, I find." Elizabeth regarded his manner, and thought that she could discern a tinge on his cheek that spoke of the shame of conscious poverty. She said no more, but suffered her own champion to make a trial. Although Natty Bumppo had certainly made hundreds of more momentous shots at his enemies or his game, yet he never exerted himself more to excel. He raised his piece several times; once to get his range, once to calculate his distance, and once because the bird, alarmed by the deathlike stillness, turned its head quickly to examine its foes. But the fourth time he fired, the smoke, the report, and the momentary shock prevented most of the spectators from instantly knowing the result. But Elizabeth, when she saw her champion drop the end of his rifle in the snow, and open his mouth in one of its silent laughs, and then proceed very coolly to recharge his piece, knew that he had been successful. The boys rushed to the mark and lifted the turkey on high, lifeless, and with nothing but the remnant of a head. "Bring in the creature," said Leatherstocking, "and put it at the feet of the lady. I was her deputy in the matter, and the bird is her property." "And a good deputy you have proved yourself," returned Elizabeth; "so good, Cousin Richard, that I would advise you to remember his qualities." She paused, and the gayety that beamed on her face gave place to a more serious earnestness. She even blushed a little as she turned to the young hunter, and with the charm of a woman's manner added, "But it was only to see an exhibition of the far famed skill of Leatherstocking that I tried my fortunes. Will you, sir, accept the bird as a small peace offering for the hurt that prevented your own success?" The expression with which the youth received this presentment was indescribable. He appeared to yield to the blandishment of her air, in opposition to a strong impulse to the contrary. He bowed, and raised the victim silently from her feet, but continued silent. Elizabeth handed the black piece of silver as a remuneration for his loss, which had some effect in again unbending his muscles, and then expressed to her companion her readiness to return homeward.
"Wait a minute, Cousin Bess," cried Richard. "There is an uncertainty about the rules of this sport that is proper I should remove. If you will appoint a committee, gentlemen, to wait on me this morning, I will draw up in writing a set of regulations."
He stopped with some indignation, for at that instant a hand was laid familiarly on the shoulder of the High Sheriff of
"A Merry Christmas to you, Cousin Deacon,"
said Judge Temple, who had approached the party unperceived.
"I must have a vigilant eye to my daughter, sir, if you are to be seized daily from these gallant fits. I admire the taste with which you introduce the lady to such scenes."
"It is her own perversity, Duke,"
cried the disappointed sheriff, who felt the loss of the first salutation as grievously as many a man would a much greater misfortune.
"and I must say that she comes honestly by it. I let her out to show her the improvements, but away she scampered through the snow at the first sound of firearms, the same as if she had been brought up in a camp instead of a first-rate boarding school. I do think, Judge Temple, that such dangerous amusements should be suppressed by statute. Nay, I doubt whether they are not already indictable at common law."
"Well, sir, as you are sheriff of the county, it becomes your duty to examine into the matter," returned the smiling Marmaduke. "I perceive that Bess has executed her commission, and I hope it met with a favorable reception."
Richard glanced his eyes at the packet which he held in his hand, and the slight anger produced by disappointment vanished instantly.
"Ah, Duke, my fair cousin," he said, "step a little on one side. I have something I will say to you."
Marmaduke complied, and the sheriff led him a little distance in the bushes, and continued:
"First, Duke, let me thank you for your friendly interest with the council and the governor, without which I am confident that the greatest merit would avail but little. But we are sisters' children, and you may use me like one of your horses, ride me or drive me. Duke, I am wholly yours; but in my humble opinion This young companion of Leatherstocking requires looking after. He has a very dangerous propensity for turkey."
"Leave him to my management, Dickon,"
said the Judge.
"and I will cure his appetite by indulgence. It is with him that I would speak. Let us rejoin the sportsmen."
Chapter 17. This reading by Gary W. Sherwin, of Yukon, Pennsylvania, in September of 2009. Chapter 18 of The Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18. Poor wretch! The mother that him bare, if she had been in presence there, in his wan face and sunburnt hair, she had not known her child. Scott. It diminished in no degree the effect produced by the conversation which passed between Judge Temple and the young hunter, that the former took the arm of his daughter and drew it through his own, when he advanced from the spot whither Richard had led him to that where the youth was standing, leaning on his rifle, and contemplating the dead bird at his feet. The presence of Marmaduke did not interrupt the sports, which were resumed by loud and clamorous disputes concerning the conditions of a chance that involved the life of a bird of much inferior quality to the last. Leatherstocking and Mohegan had alone drawn aside to their youthful companion, and, although in the immediate vicinity of such a throng, the following conversation was heard only by those who were interested in it. "I have greatly injured you, Mr. Edwards," said the Judge, but the sudden and inexplicable start with which the person spoken to received this unexpected address caused him to pause a moment. As no answer was given, and the strong emotion exhibited in the countenance of the youth gradually passed away, he continued: "But fortunately it is in some measure in my power to compensate you for what I have done. My kinsman, Richard Jones, has received an appointment that will in future deprive me of his assistance, and leave me just now destitute of one who might greatly aid me with his pen. Your manner, notwithstanding appearances, is a sufficient proof of your education, nor will thy shoulder suffer thee to labor for some time to come." Marmaduke insensibly relapsed into the language of the friends as he grew warm. "My doors are open to thee, my young friend, for in this infant country we harbor no suspicions, little offering to tempt the cupidity of the evil disposed. Become my assistant, for at least a season, and receive such compensation as thy services will deserve." There was nothing in the manner of the offer of the Judge to justify the reluctance, amounting nearly to loathing, with which the youth listened to his speech. But, after a powerful effort for self-command, he replied: "I would serve you, sir, or any other man, for an honest support; for I do not affect to conceal that my necessities are very great, even beyond what appearances would indicate. But I am fearful that such new duties would interfere too much with more important business, so that I must decline your offer, and depend on my rifle, as before, for subsistence." Richard here took occasion to whisper to the young lady, who had shrunk a little from the foreground of the picture: "This, you see, Cousin Bess, is the natural reluctance of a half-breed to leave the savage state. Their attachment to a wandering life is, I verily believe, unconquerable." "It is a precarious life," observed Marmaduke, without hearing the sheriff's observation, "and one that brings more evils with it than present suffering. Trust me, young friend, my experience is greater than thine, when I tell thee that the unsettled life of these hunters is a vast disadvantage for temporal purposes, and it totally removes one from the influence of more sacred things." "No, no, Judge," interrupted the Leatherstocking, who was hitherto unseen or disregarded. "Take him into your shanty and welcome, but tell him truth. I have lived in the woods for 40 long years,
and have spent 5 at a time without seeing the light of a clearing bigger than a window in the trees. And I should like to know where you'll find a man in his 68th year who can get an easier living, for all your betterments and your dear laws. And, as for honesty, or doing what's right between man and man, I'll not turn my back to the longest-winded deacon on your patent." "Thou art an exception, Leatherstocking," returned the judge, nodding good-naturedly at the hunter, "for thou hast a temperance unusual in thy class, and a hardihood exceeding thy years. But this youth is made of materials too precious to be wasted in the forest. I entreat thee to join my family, if it be but till thy arm is healed. My daughter here, who is mistress of my dwelling, will tell thee that thou art welcome." "Certainly," said Elizabeth, whose earnestness was a little checked by female reserve. "The unfortunate would be welcome at any time, but doubly so when we feel that we have occasioned the evil ourselves." "Yes," said Richard, "and if you relish turkey, young man, there are plenty in the coops, and of the best kind, I can assure you." Finding himself thus ably seconded, Marmaduke pushed his advantage to the utmost. He entered into a detail of the duties that would attend the situation, and circumstantially mentioned the reward, and all those points which are deemed of importance among men of business. The youth listened in extreme agitation. There was an evident contest in his feelings. At times he appeared to wish eagerly for the change, and then again the incomprehensible expression of disgust would cross his features, like a dark cloud obscuring a noonday sun. The Indian, in whose manner the depression of self-abasement was most powerfully exhibited, listened to the offers of the judge with an interest that increased with each syllable. Gradually he grew nigher to the group, and when, with his keen glance, he detected the most marked evidence of yielding in the countenance of his young companion, he changed at once from his attitude and look of shame to the front of an Indian warrior, and moving, with great dignity, closer to the parties, he spoke. "Listen to your father," he said. "His words are old. Let the young eagle and the great land chief eat together. Let them sleep, without fear, near each other. The children of Miquon love not blood. They are just, and will do right. The sun must rise and set often, before men can make one family. It is not the work of a day, but of many winters. The Mingoes and the Delawares are born enemies. Their blood can never mix in the wigwam. It never will run in the same stream in the battle. What makes the brother of Miquon and the Young Eagle foes? They are of the same tribe. Their fathers and mothers are one. Learn to wait, my son. You are a Delaware, and an Indian warrior knows how to be patient." This figurative address seemed to have great weight with the young man, who gradually yielded to the representations of Marmaduke, and eventually consented to his proposal. It was, however, to be an experiment only, and, if either of the parties thought fit to rescind the engagement, it was left at his option to do so. The remarkable and ill-concealed reluctance of the youth to accept of an offer which most men in his situation would consider as an unhoped-for elevation, occasioned no little surprise in those to whom he was a stranger, and it left a slight impression to his disadvantage. When the parties separated, they very naturally made the subject the topic of a conversation, which we shall relate, first commencing with the judge, his daughter, and Richard, who were slowly pursuing the way back to the mansion house. "I have surely endeavored to remember the holy mandates of our Redeemer, when he bids us love them who despitefully use you, in my intercourse with this incomprehensible boy," said Marmaduke. "I know not what there is in my dwelling to frighten a lad of his years, unless it may be thy presence and visage, Bess." "No, no," said Richard, with great simplicity, "it is not Cousin Bess. But when did you ever know a half-breed, 'Duke, who could bear civilization? For that matter, they are worse than the savages themselves. Did you notice how knock-kneed he stood, Elizabeth, and what a wild look he had in his eyes?" "I heeded not his eyes, nor his knees, which would be all the better for a little humbling." Really, my dear sir, I think you did exercise the Christian virtue of patience to the utmost. I was disgusted with his airs, long before he consented to make one of our family. Truly, we are much honored by the association. In what apartment is he to be placed, sir? And at what table is he to receive his nectar and ambrosia?" "With Benjamin and Remarkable," interrupted Mr. Jones. "You sorely would not make the youth eat with the blacks. He is part Indian, it is true, but the natives hold the negroes in great contempt. No, no, he would starve before he would break a crust with the negroes." "I am but too happy, Dickon, to tempt him to eat with ourselves," said Marmaduke, "to think of offering even the indignity you propose." "Then, sir," said Elizabeth, with an air that was slightly affected, as if submitting to her father's orders in opposition to her own will, "it is your pleasure that he be a gentleman." "Certainly. He is to fill the station of one. Let him receive the treatment that is due to his place, until we find him unworthy of it." "Well, well, 'Duke," cried the sheriff, "you will find it no easy matter to make a gentleman of him. The old proverb says that it takes 3 generations to make a gentleman. There was my father, whom everybody knew my grandfather was an M.D., and his father a D.D., and his father came from England. I never could come at the truth of his origin, but he was either a great merchant in London, or a great country lawyer, or the youngest son of a bishop." "Here is a true American genealogy for you," said Marmaduke, laughing. "It does very well till you get across the water, where, as everything is obscure, it is certain to deal in the superlative. You are sure that your English progenitor was great, Dickon, whatever his profession might have been?" "To be sure I am," returned the other. "I have heard my old aunt talk of him by the month. We are of a good family, Judge Temple, and have never filled any but honorable stations in life." "I marvel that you should be satisfied with so scanty a provision of gentility in the olden time, Dickon. Most of the American genealogists commence their traditions like the stories for children, with 3 brothers, taking especial care that one of the triumvirate shall be the progenitor of any of the same name who may happen to be better furnished with worldly gear than themselves. But here all are equal who know how to conduct themselves with propriety, and Oliver Edwards comes into my family on a footing with both the high sheriff and the judge." "Well, 'Duke, I call this democracy, not republicanism. But I say nothing. Only let him keep within the law, or I shall show him that the freedom of even this country is under wholesome restraint. Surely, Dickon, you will not execute till I condemn. But what says best to the new inmate? We must pay a deference to the ladies in this matter, after all." "Oh, sir," returned Elizabeth, "I believe I am much like a certain Judge Temple in this particular, not easily to be turned from my opinion. But to be serious, although I must think the introduction of a demi-savage into the family is a somewhat startling event, whomsoever you think proper to countenance may be sure of my respect." The judge drew her arm more closely in his own and smiled, while Richard led the way through the gate of the little courtyard in the rear of the dwelling, dealing out his ambiguous warnings with his accustomed loquacity. On the other hand, the foresters, for the 3 hunters, notwithstanding their difference in character, well deserved this common name, pursued their course along the skirts of the village in silence. It was not until they had reached the lake, and were moving over its frozen surface toward the foot of the mountain, where the hut stood, that the youth exclaimed: "Who could have foreseen this a month since? I have consented to serve Marmaduke Temple, to be an inmate in the dwelling of the greatest enemy of my race. Yet what better could I do? The servitude cannot be long, and when the motive for submitting to it ceases to exist, I will shake it off like the dust from my feet." "Is he a Mingo that you will call him enemy?" said Mohegan. "The Delaware warrior sits still, and waits the time of the Great Spirit. He is no woman, to cry out like a child." "Well, I'm mistrustful, John," said Leatherstocking, in whose air there had been, during the whole business, a strong expression of doubt and uncertainty. "They say that there's new laws in the land, and I'm sartain that there's new ways in the mountains. One hardly knows the lakes and streams, they've altered the country so much. I must say I'm mistrustful of such smooth speakers, for I've known the whites talk fair when they wanted the Indian lands most. This I will say, though I'm a white myself, and was born nigh York, and of honest parents too." "I will submit," said the youth. "I will forget who I am, cease to remember, old Mohegan, that I am the descendant of a Delaware chief, who once was master of these noble hills, these beautiful vales, and of this water over which we tread. Yes, yes, I will become his bondsman, his slave. Is it not an honorable servitude, old man?" "Old man!" repeated the Indian solemnly, and pausing in his walk, as usual, when much excited. "Yes, John is old, son of my brother. If Mohegan was young, when would his rifle be still? Where would the deer hide, and he not find him? But John is old. His hand is the hand of a squaw. His tomahawk is a hatchet. Brooms and baskets are his enemies. He strikes no other. Hunger and old age come together. See Hawkeye. When young, he would go days and eat nothing. But should he not put the brush on the fire now, the blaze would go out. Take the son of Miquon by the hand, and he will help you." "I'm not the man I was, I'll own, Chingachgook," returned the Leatherstocking, "but I can go without a meal now, on occasion. When we tracked the Iroquois through the beech woods, they drove the game afore them, for I hadn't a morsel to eat from Monday morning come Wednesday sundown, and then I shot as fat a buck on the Pennsylvany line as ever mortal laid eyes on. It would have done your heart good to have seen the Delaware eat, for I was out scouting and scrimmaging with their tribe at the time. Lord, the Indians, lad, lay still, and just waited till Providence should send them their game, but I foraged about and put a deer up, and put him down too, afore he had made a dozen jumps. I was too weak and too ravenous to stop for his flesh, so I took a good drink of his blood, and the Indians ate of his meat raw. John was there, and John knows, but then starvation would be apt to be too much for me now, I will own, though I'm no great eater at any time." "Enough is said, my friend," cried the youth. "I feel that everywhere the sacrifice is required at my hands, and it shall be made. But say no more, I entreat you. I cannot bear this subject now." His companions were silent, and they soon reached the hut, which they entered, after removing certain complicated and ingenious fastenings that were put there apparently to guard a property of but very little value. Immense piles of snow lay against the log walls of this secluded habitation on one side, while fragments of small trees and branches of oak and chestnut, that had been torn from their parent stems by the winds, were thrown into a pile on the other. A small column of smoke rose through a chimney of sticks cemented with clay, along the side of the rock, and had marked the snow above with its dark tinges, in a wavy line, from the point of emission to another, where the hill receded from the brow of a precipice, and held a soil that nourished trees of a gigantic growth, that overhung the little bottom beneath. The remainder of the day passed off as such days are commonly spent in a new country. The settlers thronged to the academy again to witness the second effort of Mr. Grant, and Mohegan was one of his hearers. But, notwithstanding the divine fixed his eyes intently on the Indian when he invited his congregation to advance to the table, the shame of last night's abasement was yet too keen in the old chief to suffer him to move. When the people were dispersing, the clouds that had been gathering all the morning were dense and dirty, and before half of the curious congregation had reached their different cabins, that were placed in every glen and hollow of the mountains, or perched on the summits of the hills themselves, the rain was falling in torrents. The dark edges of the stumps began to exhibit themselves, as the snow settled rapidly. The fences of logs and brush, which before had been only traced by long lines of white mounds that ran across the valley and up the mountains, peeped out from their covering, and the black stubs were momentarily becoming more distinct, as large masses of snow and ice fell from their sides, under the influence of the thaw. Sheltered in the warm hall of her father's comfortable mansion, Elizabeth, accompanied by Louisa Grant, looked abroad with admiration at the ever-varying face of things without. Even the village, which had just before been glittering with the color of the frozen element, reluctantly dropped its mask, and the houses exposed their dark roofs and smoked chimneys. The pines shook off the covering of snow, and everything seemed to be assuming its proper hues, with a transition that bordered on the supernatural. End of chapter 18. Recording by Bill Vorst. Chapter 19. Of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 19. And yet poor Edwin was no vulgar boy. Beatty. The close of Christmas Day, A.D. 1793, was tempestuous, but comparatively warm. When darkness had again hid the objects in the village from the gaze of Elizabeth, she turned from the window, where she had remained while the least vestige of light lingered over the tops of the dark pines, with a curiosity that was rather excited than appeased by the passing glimpses of woodland scenery that she had caught during the day. With her arm locked in that of Miss Grant, the young mistress of the mansion walked slowly up and down the hall, musing on scenes that were rapidly recurring to her memory, and possibly dwelling, at times, in the sanctuary of her thoughts, on the strange occurrences that had led to the introduction to her father's family of one whose manners so singularly contradicted the inferences to be drawn from his situation. The expiring heat of the apartment, for its great size required a day to reduce its temperature, had given to her cheeks a bloom that exceeded their natural color, while the mild and melancholy features of Louisa were brightened with a faint tinge that, like the hectic of disease, gave a painful interest to her beauty. The eyes of the gentlemen, who were yet seated around the rich wines of Judge Temple, frequently wandered from the table, that was placed at one end of the hall, to the forms that were silently moving over its length. Much mirth, and that, at times of a boisterous kind, proceeded from the mouth of Richard. But Major Hartmann was not yet excited to his pitch of merriment, and Marmaduke respected the presence of his clerical guests too much to indulge in even the innocent humor that formed no small ingredient in his character. Such were, and such continued to be, the pursuits of the party, for half an hour after the shutters were closed, and candles were placed in various parts of the hall, as substitutes for departing daylight. The appearance of Benjamin, staggering under the burden of an armful of wood, was the first interruption to this scene. "How now, Master Pump?" roared the newly appointed sheriff. "Is there not warmth enough in Duke's best Madeira to keep up the animal heat through this thaw? Remember, old boy, that the Judge is particular with his beech and maple, beginning to dread already a scarcity of the precious articles. Ha, ha, ha! Duke, you are a good warm-hearted relation, I will own, as in duty bound, but you have some queer notions about you, after all. Come, let us be jolly, and cast away folly." The notes gradually sank into a hum, while the major domo threw down his load, and, turning to his interrogator, with an air of earnestness, replied: "Why, look you, Squire Dickon, mayhap there's a warm latitude round about the table there, though it's not the stuff to raise the heat in my body, neither; the rail Jamaiky being the only thing to do that, besides good wood, or some such matter as Newcastle coal. But if I know anything of the weather, d'ye see, it's time to be getting all snug, and for putting the ports in, and stirring the fires a bit. Mayhap I've not followed the seas 27 years, and lived another 7 in these here woods, for nothing, gemmen." "Why, does it bid fair for a change in the weather, Benjamin?" inquired the master of the house. "There's a shift of wind, your honor," returned the steward, "and when there's a shift of wind, you may look for a change in this here climate. I was aboard one of Rodney's fleet, d'ye see, about the time we licked De Grasse, Monsieur Lorquois' countryman, there, and the wind was here at the south'ard and east'ard, and I was below mixing a toothful of hot stuff for the captain of marines, who dined, d'ye see, in the cabin that there very same day, and I suppose he wanted to put out the captain's fire with a gun-room ingin, and so, just as I got it to my own liking, after tasting pretty often, for the soldier was difficult to please, slap came the foresail ag'in the mast, whiz went the ship around on her heel like a whirligig, and a lucky thing was it that our helm was down, for as she gathered starnway, she paid off, which was more than every ship in the fleet did, or could do. But she strained herself in the trough of the sea, and she shipped a deal of water over her quarter. I never swallowed so much clear water at a time in my life as I did then, for I was looking up the after hatch at the instant." "I wonder, Benjamin, that you did not die with the dropsy," said Marmaduke. "I mought, Judge," said the old tar, with a broad grin; "but there was no need of the medicine chest for a cure, for as I thought the brew was spoiled for the marine's taste, and there was no telling when another sea might come and spoil it for mine, I finished the mug on the spot. So then all hands was called to the pumps, and there we began to ply the pumps." "Well, but the weather?" interrupted Marmaduke. "What of the weather without doors?" "Why, here the wind has been all day at the south, and now there's a lull, as if the last blast was out of the bellows, and there's a streak along the mountains to the north'ard, that just now wasn't wider than the bigness of your hand, and then the clouds drive afore it as you'd brail a mainsail, and the stars are heaving in sight like so many lights and beacons, put there to warn us to pile on the wood. And, if so be that I'm a judge of weather, it's getting to be time to build on a fire, or you'll have half of them there porter bottles, and them demijohns of wine in the locker here breaking with the frost, afore the morning watch is called." "Thou art a prudent sentinel," said the Judge. "Act thy pleasure with the forests for this night at feast." Benjamin did as he was ordered, nor had 2 hours elapsed before the prudence of his precautions became very visible. The south wind had indeed blown itself out, and it was succeeded by the calmness that usually gave warning of a serious change in the weather. Long before the family retired to rest, the cold had become cuttingly severe, and when Monsieur Lacroix sallied forth under a bright moon to seek his own abode, he was compelled to beg a blanket, in which he might envelop his form, in addition to the numerous garments that his sagacity had provided for the occasion. The divine and his daughter remained as inmates of the mansion house during the night, and the excess of last night's merriment induced the gentlemen to make an early retreat to their several apartments. Long before midnight the whole family were invisible. Elizabeth and her friend had not yet lost their senses in sleep, and the howlings of the northwest wind were heard around the buildings, and brought with them that exquisite sense of comfort that is ever excited under such circumstances, in an apartment where the fire has not yet ceased to glimmer, and curtains and shutters and feathers unite to preserve the desired temperature. Once, just as her eyes had opened, apparently in the last stage of drowsiness, the roaring winds brought with them a long and plaintive howl, that seemed too wild for a dog, and yet resembled the cries of that faithful animal, when night awakens his vigilance and gives sweetness and solemnity to its charms. The form of Louisa Grant instinctively pressed nearer to that of the young heiress, who, finding her companion was yet awake, said in a low tone, as if afraid to break a charm with her voice: "Those distant cries are plaintive, and even beautiful. Can they be the hounds from the hut of Leatherstocking?" "They are wolves, who have ventured from the mountain on the lake," whispered Louisa, "and who are only kept from the village by the lights. One night since we have been here, hunger drove them to our very door. Oh, what a dreadful night it was! But the riches of Judge Temple have given him too many safeguards to leave room for fear in this house." "The enterprise of Judge Temple is taming the very forests," exclaimed Elizabeth, throwing off her covering, and partly rising in the bed. "How rapidly is civilization treading on the foot of nature!" she continued, as her eye glanced over not only the comforts, but the luxuries of her apartment, and her ear again listened to the distant, but often repeated howls from the lake. Finding, however, that the timidity of her companion rendered the sounds painful to her, Elizabeth resumed her place, and soon forgot the changes in the country, with those in her own condition in a deep sleep. The following morning, the noise of the female servant, who entered the apartment to light the fire, awoke the females. They arose, and finished the slight preparations of their toilets in a clear, cold atmosphere, that penetrated through all the defences of even Miss Temple's warm room. When Elizabeth was attired, she approached a window and drew its curtain, and throwing open its shutters, she endeavored to look abroad on the village and the lake. But a thick covering of frost on the glass, while it admitted the light, shut out the view. She raised the sash, and then, indeed, a glorious scene met her delighted eye. The lake had exchanged its covering of unspotted snow for a face of dark ice, that reflected the rays of the rising sun like a polished mirror. The houses, clothed in a dress of the same description, but which, owing to its position, shone like bright steel, while the enormous icicles that were pendant from every roof caught the brilliant light, apparently throwing it from one to the other, as each glittered, on the side next the luminary, with a golden lustre that melted away, on its opposite, into the dusky shades of a background. But it was the appearance of the boundless forests that covered the hills as they rose in the distance, one over the other, that most attracted the gaze of Miss Temple. The huge branches of the pines and hemlocks bent with the weight of the ice they supported, while their summits rose above the swelling tops of the oaks, beeches, and maples, like spires of burnished silver issuing from domes of the same material. The limits of the view, in the west, were marked by an undulating outline of bright light, as if reversing the order of nature. Numberless suns might momentarily be expected to heave above the horizon. In the foreground of the picture, along the shores of the lake, and near to the village, each tree seemed studded with diamonds. Even the sides of the mountains, where the rays of the sun could not yet fall, were decorated with a glassy coat, that presented every gradation of brilliancy, from the first touch of the luminary to the dark foliage of the hemlock, glistening through its coat of crystal. In short, the whole view was one scene of quivering radiancy, as lake, mountains, village, and woods each emitted a portion of light, tinged with its peculiar hue, and varied by its position and its magnitude. "See!" cried Elizabeth. "See, Louisa! Hasten to the window and observe the miraculous change." Miss Grant complied, and after bending for a moment in silence from the opening, she observed in a low tone, as if afraid to trust the sound of her voice, "The change is indeed wonderful. I am surprised that he should be able to effect it so soon." Elizabeth turned in amazement, to hear so skeptical a sentiment from one educated like her companion, but was surprised to find that, instead of looking at the view, the mild blue eyes of Miss Grant were dwelling on the form of a well-dressed young man, who was standing before the door of the building, in earnest conversation with her father. A second look was necessary before she was able to recognize the person of the young hunter in a plain, but assuredly the ordinary, garb of a gentleman. "Everything in this magical country seems to border on the marvellous," said Elizabeth, "and among all the changes, this is certainly not the least wonderful. The actors are as unique as the scenery." Miss Grant colored and drew in her head. "I am a simple country girl, Miss Temple, and I am afraid you will find me but a poor companion," she said. I am not sure that I understand all you say, but I really thought that you wished me to notice the alteration in Mr. Edwards. Is it not more wonderful when we recollect his origin? They say he is part Indian." "He is a genteel savage. But let us go down, and give the sachem his tea, for I suppose he is a descendant of King Philip, if not a grandson of Pocahontas." The ladies were met in the hall by Judge Temple, who took his daughter aside to apprise her of that alteration in the appearance of their new inmate, with which she was already acquainted. "He appears reluctant to converse on his former situation," continued Marmaduke, "but I gathered from his discourse, as is apparent from his manner, that he has seen better days, and I am really inclining to the opinion of Richard as to his origin, for it was no unusual thing for the Indian agents to rear their children in a laudable manner, and—" "Very well, my dear sir," interrupted his daughter, laughing and averting her eyes, "it is all well enough, I dare say, but as I do not understand a word of the Mohawk language, he must be content to speak English; and as for his behavior, I trust to your discernment to control it." "Ay, but, Bess," cried the Judge, detaining her gently by the hand, "nothing must be said to him of his past life. This he has begged particularly of me as a favor. He is, perhaps, a little soured just now with his wounded arm. The injury seems very light; at another time he may be more communicative." "Oh, I am not much troubled, sir, with that laudable thirst after knowledge that is called curiosity. I shall believe him to be the child of Cornstalk, or Cornplanter, or some other renowned chieftain, possibly of the Big Snake himself, and shall treat him as such until he sees fit to shave his good-looking head, borrow some half-dozen pair of my best ear-rings, shoulder his rifle again, and disappear as suddenly as he made his entrance. So come, my dear sir, and let us not forget the rites of hospitality, for the short time he is to remain with us." Judge Temple smiled at the playfulness of his child, and taking her arm they entered the breakfast parlor, where the young hunter was seated with an air that showed his determination to domesticate himself in the family with as little parade as possible. Such were the incidents that led to this extraordinary increase in the family of Judge Temple, where, having once established the youth, the subject of our tale requires us to leave him for a time, to pursue with diligence and intelligence the employments that were assigned him by Marmaduke. Major Hartmann made his customary visit, and took his leave of the party for the next 3 months. Mr. Grant was compelled to be absent most of his time in remote parts of the country, and his daughter became almost a constant visitor at the mansion house. Richard entered, with his constitutional eagerness, on the duties of his new office; and, as Marmaduke was much employed with the constant applications of adventures for farms, the winter passed swiftly away. The lake was the principal scene for the amusements of the young people, where the ladies, in their one-horse cutter, driven by Richard, and attended, when the snow would admit of it, by young Edwards on his skates, spent many hours taking the benefit of exercise in the clear air of the hills. The reserve of the youth gradually gave way to time and his situation, though it was still evident, to a close observer, that he had frequent moments of bitter and intense feeling. Elizabeth saw many large openings appear in the sides of the mountains during the 3 succeeding months, where different settlers had, in the language of the country, made their pitch, while the numberless sleighs that passed through the village, loaded with wheat and barrels of potashes, afforded a clear demonstration that all these labors were not undertaken in vain. In short, the whole country was exhibiting the bustle of a thriving settlement, where the highways were thronged with sleighs, bearing piles of rough household furniture, studded here and there with the smiling faces of women and children, happy in the excitement of novelty, or with loads of produce, hastening to the common market at Albany, that served as so many snares to induce the emigrants to enter into those wild mountains in search of competence and happiness. The village was alive with business, the artisans increasing in wealth with the prosperity of the country, and each day witnessing some nearer approach to the manners and usages of an old settled town. The man who carried the mail, or the post as he was called, talked much of running a stage, and once or twice during the winter he was seen taking a single passenger, in his cutter, through the snowbanks, toward the Mohawk, along which a regular vehicle glided, semi-weekly, with the velocity of lightning, and under the direction of a knowing whip from the down countries. Toward spring, divers families, who had been into the old States to see their relatives, returned in time to save the snow, frequently bringing with them whole neighborhoods, who were tempted by their representations to leave the farms of Connecticut and Massachusetts to make a trial of fortune in the woods. During all this time, Oliver Edwards, whose sudden elevation excited no surprise in that changeful country, was earnestly engaged in the service of Marmaduke, during the days, but his nights were often spent in the hut of Leatherstocking. The intercourse between the 3 hunters was maintained with a certain air of mystery, it is true, but with much zeal and apparent interest to all the parties. Even Mohegans seldom came to the mansion house, and Natty never, but Edwards sought every leisure moment to visit his former abode, from which he would often return in the gloomy hours of night, through the snow, or, if detained beyond the time at which the family retired to rest, with the morning sun. These visits certainly excited much speculation in those to whom they were known, but no comments were made, excepting occasionally in whispers from Richard, who would say, "It is not at all remarkable. A half-breed can never be weaned from the savage ways, and, for one of his lineage, the boy is much nearer civilization than could in reason be expected." End of chapter 19. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 20. Of the Pioneers, or The Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 20. Away! Nor let me loiter in my song, for we have many a mountain path to tread. Byron. As the spring gradually approached, the immense piles of snow that, by alternate thaws and frosts, and repeated storms, had obtained a firmness which threatened a tiresome durability, began to yield to the influence of milder breezes and a warmer sun. The gates of heaven at times seemed to open, and a bland air diffused itself over the earth, when animate and inanimate nature would awaken, and for a few hours the gaiety of spring shone in every eye and smiled on every field. But the shivering blasts from the north would carry their chill influence over the scene again, and the dark and gloomy clouds that intercepted the rays of the sun were not more cold and dreary than the reaction. These struggles between the seasons became daily more frequent, while the earth, like a victim to contention, slowly lost the animated brilliancy of winter, without obtaining the aspect of spring. Several weeks were consumed in this cheerless manner, during which the inhabitants of the country gradually changed their pursuits from the social and bustling movements of the time of snow to the laborious and domestic engagements of the coming season. The village was no longer thronged with visitors. The trade that had enlivened the shops for several months began to disappear. The highways lost their shining coats of beaten snow in impassable sloughs, and were deserted by the gay and noisy travelers who, in sleighs, had, during the winter, glided along their windings; and, in short, everything seemed indicative of a mighty change, not only in the earth, but in those who derived their sources of comfort and happiness from its bosom. The younger members of the family in the mansion house, of which Louisa Grant was now habitually one, were by no means indifferent observers of these fluctuating and tardy changes. While the snow rendered the roads passable, they had partaken largely in the amusements of the winter, which included not only daily rides over the mountains, and through every valley within 20 miles of them, but divers ingenious and varied sources of pleasure on the bosom of their frozen lake. There had been excursions in the equipage of Richard, when with his 4 horses he had outstripped the winds, as it flew over the glassy ice which invariably succeeded a thaw. Then the exciting and dangerous whirligig would be suffered to possess its moment of notice. Cutters, drawn by a single horse, and hand sleds, impelled by the gentlemen on skates, would each in turn be used; and, in short, every source of relief against the tediousness of a winter in the mountains was resorted to by the family. Elizabeth was compelled to acknowledge to her father that the season, with the aid of his library, was much less irksome than she had anticipated. As exercise in the open air was in some degree necessary to the habits of the family, when the constant recurrence of frosts and thaws rendered the roads, which were dangerous at the most favorable times, utterly impassable for wheels, saddle horses were used as substitutes for other conveyances. Mounted on small and sure-footed beasts, the ladies would again attempt the passages of the mountains, and penetrate into every retired glen where the enterprise of a settler had induced him to establish himself. In these excursions they were attended by some one or all of the gentlemen of the family, as their different pursuits admitted. Young Edwards was hourly becoming more familiarized to his situation, and not infrequently mingled in the parties with an unconcern and gaiety that for a short time would expel all unpleasant recollections from his mind. Habit, and the buoyancy of youth, seemed to be getting the ascendancy over the secret causes of his uneasiness, though there were moments when the same remarkable expression of disgust would cross his intercourse with Marmaduke that had distinguished their conversations in the first days of their acquaintance. It was at the close of the month of March that the sheriff succeeded in persuading his cousin and her young friend to accompany him on a ride to a hill that was said to overhang the lake in a manner peculiar to itself. "Besides, Cousin Bess," continued the indefatigable Richard, "we will stop and see the sugar bush of Billy Kirby. He is on the east end of the Ransom lot, making sugar for Jared Ransom. There is not a better hand over a kettle in the county than that same Kirby. You remember, 'Duke, that I had him his first season in our camp, and it is not a wonder that he knows something of his trade." "He's a good chopper, is Billy," observed Benjamin, who held the bridle of the horse while the sheriff mounted. "And he handles an axe much the same as a forecastleman does his marlingspike, or a tailor his goose. They say he'll lift a potash kettle off the arch alone, though I can't say that I've ever seen him do it with my own eyes. But that is the say. And I've seen sugar of his making, which maybe wasn't as white as an old topgallant sail, but which my friend Mistress Pettibones within there said had the true molasses smack to it. And you are not the one, Squire Dickens, to be told that Mistress Remarkable has a remarkable tooth for sweet things in her nut grinder." The loud laugh that succeeded the wit of Benjamin, and in which he participated with no very harmonious sounds himself, very fully illustrated the congenial temper which existed between the pair. Most of its point was, however, lost on the rest of the party, who were either mounting their horses or assisting the ladies at the moment. When all were safely in their saddles, they moved through the village in great order. They paused for a moment before the door of Monsieur Le Quoi, until he could bestride his steed, and then, issuing from the little cluster of houses, they took one of the principal of those highways that centered in the village. As each night brought with it a severe frost, which the heat of the succeeding day served to dissipate, the equestrians were compelled to proceed singly along the margin of the road, where the turf and firmness of the ground gave the horses a secure footing. Very trifling indications of vegetation were to be seen, the surface of the earth presenting a cold, wet, and cheerless aspect that chilled the blood. The snow yet lay scattered over most of those distant clearings that were visible in different parts of the mountains, though here and there an opening might be seen where, as the white covering yielded to the season, the bright and lively green of the wheat served to enkindle the hopes of the husbandman. Nothing could be more marked than the contrast between the earth and the heavens, for, while the former presented the dreary view that we have described, a warm and invigorating sun was dispensing his heats from a sky that contained but a solitary cloud, and through an atmosphere that softened the colors of the sensible horizon until it shone like a sea of blue. Richard led the way on this, as on all other occasions that did not require the exercise of unusual abilities, and as he moved along he essayed to enliven the party with the sounds of his experienced voice. "This is your true sugar weather, 'Duke," he cried. "A frosty night, and a sunshiny day. I warrant me that the sap runs like a mill-tail up the maples this warm morning. It is a pity, Judge, that you do not introduce a little more science into the manufactory of sugar among your tenants. It might be done, sir, without knowing as much as Dr. Franklin. It might be done, Judge Temple." "The first object of my solicitude, friend Jones," returned Marmaduke, "is to protect the sources of this great mine of comfort and wealth from the extravagance of the people themselves. When this important point shall be achieved, it will be in season to turn our attention to an improvement in the manufacture of the article. But thou knowest, Richard, that I have already subjected our sugar to the process of the refiner, and that the result has produced loaves as white as the snow on yon fields, and possessing the saccharine quality in its utmost purity." "Saccharine, or turpentine, or any other ine, Judge Temple, you have never made a loaf larger than a good-sized sugar-plum," returned the sheriff. "Now, sir, I assert that no experiment is fairly tried until it be reduced to practical purposes. If, sir, I owned 100, or, for that matter, 200,000 acres of land, as you do, I would build a sugar house in the village. I would invite learned men to an investigation of the subject, and such are easily to be found, sir. Yes, sir, they are not difficult to find, men who unite theory with practice, and I would select a wood of young and thrifty trees, and instead of making loaves of the size of a lump of candy, damn me, 'Duke, but I'd have them as big as a haycock." "And purchase the cargo of one of those ships that they say are going to China," cried Elizabeth. "Turn your potash kettles into teacups, the scows on the lake into saucers, bake your cake in yonder lime-kiln, and invite the county to a tea-party. How wonderful are the projects of genius! Really, sir, the world is of opinion that Judge Temple has tried the experiment fairly, though he did not cause his loaves to be cast in moulds of the magnitude that would suit your magnificent conceptions." "You may laugh, Cousin Elizabeth, you may laugh, madam," retorted Richard, turning himself so much in his saddle as to face the party, and making dignified gestures with his whip; "but I appeal to common sense, good sense, or what is of more importance than either, to the sense of taste, which is one of the 5 natural senses. Whether a big loaf of sugar is not likely to contain a better illustration of a proposition than such a lump as one of your Dutch women puts under her tongue when she drinks her tea. There are 2 ways of doing everything, the right way and the wrong way. You make sugar now, I will admit, and you may possibly make loaf sugar, but I take the question to be, whether you make the best possible sugar, and in the best possible loaves." "Thou art very right, Richard," observed Marmaduke, with a gravity in his air that proved how much he was interested in the subject. "It is very true that we manufacture sugar, and the inquiry is quite useful. How much, and in what manner? I hope to live to see the day when farms and plantations shall be devoted to this branch of business. Little is known concerning the properties of the tree itself, the source of all this wealth, how much it may be improved by cultivation, by the use of the hoe and plough." "Hoe and plough!" roared the sheriff. "Would you set a man hoeing around the root of a maple like this?" pointing to one of the noble trees that occur so frequently in that part of the country. "Hoeing trees! Are you mad, 'Duke? This is next to hunting for coal. Poh, poh! My dear cousin, hear reason, and leave the management of the sugar bush to me. Here is Mr. Le Quoi. He has been in the West Indies, and has seen sugar made. Let him give an account of how it is made there, and you will hear the philosophy of the thing. Well, monsieur, how is it that you make sugar in the West Indies? Anything in Judge Temple's fashion?" The gentleman to whom this query was put was mounted on a small horse, of no very fiery temperament, and was riding with his stirrups so short as to bring his knees, while the animal rose a small ascent in the wood path they were now travelling, into a somewhat hazardous vicinity to his chin. There was no room for gesticulation or grace in the delivery of his reply, for the mountain was steep and slippery, and although the Frenchman had an eye of uncommon magnitude on either side of his face, they did not seem to be half competent to forewarn him of the impediments of bushes, twigs, and fallen trees that were momentarily crossing his path. With one hand employed in averting these dangers, and the other grasping his bridle to check an untoward speed that his horse was assuming, the native of France responded as follows: "Sucre. They do make sucre in Martinique, mais, ce n'est pas one tree vat you call, je voudrais que ces chemins fonce au diable, vat you call, stick pour la promenade?" "Cane," said Elizabeth, smiling at the imprecation which the wary Frenchman supposed was understood only by himself. "Oui, mam'selle, cane." "Yes, yes," cried Richard, "cane is the vulgar name for it, but the real term is saccharum officinarum, and what we call the sugar, or hard maple, is acer saccharinum. These are the learned names, monsieur, and are such as, doubtless, you well understand." "Is this Greek or Latin, Mr. Edwards?" whispered Elizabeth to the youth, who was opening a passage for herself and her companions through the bushes; "or perhaps it is a still more learned language, for an interpretation of which we must look to you." The dark eye of the young man glanced toward the speaker, but its resentful expression changed in a moment. I shall remember your doubts, Miss Temple, when next I visit my old friend Mohegan, and either his skill or that of Leatherstocking shall solve them." "And are you then really ignorant of their language?" "Not absolutely, but the deep learning of Mr. Jones is more familiar to me, or even the polite masquerade of Monsieur Le Quoi." "Do you speak French?" said the lady, with quickness. "It is a common language with the Iroquois, and through the Canadas," he answered, smiling. "Ah, but they are Mingoes, and your enemies." "It will be well for me if I have no worse," said the youth, dashing ahead with his horse, and putting an end to the evasive dialogue. The discourse, however, was maintained with great vigor by Richard, until they reached an open wood on the summit of the mountain, where the hemlocks and pines totally disappeared, and a grove of the very trees that formed the subject of debate covered the earth with their tall, straight trunks and spreading branches, in stately pride. The underwood had been entirely removed from this grove, or bush, as, in conjunction with the simple arrangements for boiling, it was called, and a wide space of many acres was cleared, which might be likened to the dome of a mighty temple, to which the maples formed the columns, their tops composing the capitals and the heavens the arch. A deep and careless incision had been made into each tree near its root, into which little spouts, formed of the bark of the alder or of the sumach, were fastened; and a trough, roughly dug out of the linden or basswood, was lying at the root of each tree, to catch the sap that flowed from this extremely wasteful and inartificial arrangement. The party paused a moment, on gaining the flat, to breathe their horses, and, as the scene was entirely new to several of their number, to view the manner of collecting the fluid. A fine, powerful voice aroused them from their momentary silence, as it rang under the branches of the trees, singing the following words of that inimitable doggerel, whose verses, if extended, would reach from the caters of the Connecticut to the shores of Ontario. The tune was, of course, a familiar air, which, although it is said to have been first applied to this nation in derision, circumstances have since rendered so glorious that no American ever hears its jingling cadence without feeling a thrill at his heart. "The eastern states be full of men, the western full of woods, sir, the hill be like a cattle pen, the roads be full of goods, sir, then flow away my sweetie sap, and I will make you boily, nor catch a woodman's hasty nap, for fear you should get roily. The maple tree's a precious one, 'tis fuel, food, and timber, and when your stiff day's work is done, its juice will make you limber. Then flow away my sweetie sap, and I will make you boily, nor catch a woodman's hasty nap, for fear you should get roily. And what's a man without his glass, his wife without her tea, sir? But neither cup nor mug will pass without his honey bee, sir. Then flow away my sweetie sap, and I will make you boily, nor catch a woodman's hasty nap, for fear you should get roily." During the execution of this sonorous doggerel, Richard kept time with his whip on the mane of his charger, accompanying the gestures with a corresponding movement of his head and body. Toward the close of the song he was overheard humming the chorus, and at its last repetition to strike in at "Sweetie Sap," and carry a second through, with a prodigious addition to the effect of the noise, if not to that of the harmony. "Well done us!" roared the sheriff, on the same key with the tune. "A very good song, Billy Kirby, and very well sung. Where got you the words, lad? Is there more of it, and can you furnish me with a copy?" The sugar boiler, who was busy in his camp at a short distance from the equestrians, turned his head with great indifference, and surveyed the party, as they approached, with admirable coolness. To each individual, as he or she rode close by him, he gave a nod that was extremely good-natured and affable, but which partook largely of the virtue of equality, for not even to the ladies did he in the least vary his mode of salutation, by touching the apology for a hat that he wore, or by any other motion than the one we have mentioned. "How goes it, Sheriff?" said the wood chopper. "What's the good word in the village?" "Why, much as usual, Billy," returned Richard. "But how is this? Where are your 4 kettles, and your troughs, and your iron coolers? Do you make sugar in this slovenly way? I thought you were one of the best sugar boilers in the county." "I'm all that, Squire Jones," said Kirby, who continued his occupation. "I'll turn my back to no man in the Otsego hills for chopping and logging, for boiling down the maple sap, for tending brick kiln, splitting out rails, making potash, and parling too, or hoeing corn, though I keep myself pretty much to the first business, seeing that the axe comes most natural to me." "You be von jack all trade, Mister Bill," said Monsieur Le Quoi. "How?" said Kirby, looking up with a simplicity which, coupled with his gigantic frame and manly face, was a little ridiculous. "If you be for trade, monsieur, here is some as good sugar as you'll find the season through. It's as clear from dirt as the Jarman Flats is free from stumps, and it has the rale maple flavor. Such stuff would sell in York for candy." The Frenchman approached the place where Kirby had deposited his cake of sugar, under the cover of a bark roof, and commenced the examination of the article with the eye of one who well understood its value. Marmaduke had dismounted, and was viewing the works and the trees very closely, and not without frequent expressions of dissatisfaction at the careless manner in which the manufacture was conducted. "You have much experience in these things, Kirby," he said. "What course do you pursue in making your sugar? I see you have but 2 kettles." "Two is as good as 2,000, Judge. I'm none of your polite sugar makers, that boils for the great folks; but if the rale sweet maple is wanted, I can answer your turn. First, I choose, and then I tap my trees. Say along about the last of February, or in these mountains, maybe not afore the middle of March; but anyway, just as the sap begins to cleverly run." "Well, in this choice," interrupted Marmaduke, "are you governed by any outward signs that prove the quality of the tree?" "Why, there's judgment in all things," said Kirby, stirring the liquor in his kettles briskly. "There's something in knowing when and how to stir the pot. It's a thing that must be learnt. Rome wasn't built in a day, nor for that matter Templeton either, though it may be said to be a quick growing place. I never put my axe into a stunty tree, or one that hasn't a good, fresh looking bark, for trees have disorders like creatures; and where's the policy of taking a tree that's sickly, any more than you'd choose a foundered horse to ride post, or an overheated ox to do your logging?" "All that is true; but what are the signs of illness? How do you distinguish a tree that is well from one that is diseased?" "How does the doctor tell who has fever and who colds?" interrupted Richard. "By examining the skin, and feeling the pulse, to be sure." "Sartain," continued Billy, "the squire ain't far out of the way. It's by the look of the thing, sure enough. Well, when the sap begins to get a free run, I hang over the kettles and set up the bush. My first boiling I push pretty smartly, till I get the virtue of the sap; but when it begins to grow of a molasses natur', like this one in the kettle, one mustn't drive the fires too hard, or you'll burn the sugar, and burny sugar is bad to the taste, let it be never so sweet. So you ladle out from one kettle into the other till it gets so, when you put the stirring stick into it, that it will draw into a thread, when it takes a careful hand to manage it. There is a way to drain it off, after it has grained, by putting clay into the pans, but it isn't always practised. Some doos and some doosn't. Well, monsieur, be we likely to make a trade?" "I will give you, Mr. Ettle, for 1 pound, 10 sous. No, I expect cash for it. I never dicker my sugar. But seeing that it's you, monsieur," said Billy with a coaxing smile, "I'll agree to receive a gallon of rum, and cloth enough for 2 shirts, if you'll take the molasses in the bargain. It's real good. I wouldn't deceive you or any man, and to my drinking, it's about the best molasses that come out of a sugar bush." "Mr. Le Quoi has offered you 10 pence," said young Edwards. The manufacturer stared at the speaker with an air of great freedom, but made no reply. "Oui," said the Frenchman, 10 penny. Je vous remercie, monsieur. Ah, mon Anglois, je l'oublie toujours." The wood chopper looked from one to the other with some displeasure, and evidently imbibed the opinion that they were amusing themselves at his expense. He seized the enormous ladle, which was lying on one of his kettles, and began to stir the boiling liquid with great diligence. After a moment passed in dipping the ladle full, and then raising it on high, as the thick, rich fluid fell back into the kettle, he suddenly gave it a whirl, as if to cool what yet remained, and offered the bowl to Mr. Le Quoi, saying, "Taste that, monsieur, and you will say it is worth more than you offer. The molasses itself would fetch the money." The complacent Frenchman, after several timid efforts to trust his lips in contact with the bowl of the ladle, got a good swallow of the scalding liquid. He clapped his hands on his breast, and looked most piteously at the ladies for a single instant, and then, to use the language of Billy, when he afterward recounted the tale, "No drumsticks ever went faster on the skin of a sheep than the Frenchman's legs for a round or two. And then such swearing and spitting in French you never saw. But it's a knowing one, from the old countries, that thinks to get his jokes smoothly over a wood chopper." The air of innocence with which Kirby resumed the occupation of stirring the contents of his kettles would have completely deceived the spectators as to his agency in the temporary sufferings of Mr. Le Quoi, had not the reckless fellow thrust his tongue into his cheek, and cast his eyes over the party with a simplicity of expression that was too exquisite to be natural. Mr. Le Quoi soon recovered his presence of mind and his decorum, and he briefly apologized to the ladies for one or two very intemperate expressions that had escaped him in a moment of extraordinary excitement, and, remounting his horse, he continued in the background during the remainder of the visit, the wit of Kirby putting a violent termination at once to all negotiations on the subject of trade. During all this time Marmaduke had been wandering about the grove, making observations on his favorite trees, and the wasteful manner in which the wood chopper conducted his manufacture. "It grieves me to witness the extravagance that pervades this country," said the Judge, "where the settlers trifle with the blessings they might enjoy, with the prodigality of successful adventurers. You are not exempt from the censure yourself, Kirby, for you make dreadful wounds in these trees where a small incision would effect the same object. I earnestly beg you will remember that they are the growth of centuries, and when once gone, none living will see their loss remedied." "Why, I don't know, Judge," returned the man he addressed. "It seems to me, if there's plenty of anything in this mountaneous country, it's the trees. If there's any sin in chopping them, I've a pretty heavy account to settle, for I've chopped over the best half of 1,000 acres, with my own hands, counting both Vermont and York States, and I hope to live to finish the whole, before I lay up my axe. Chopping comes quite natural to me, and I wish no other employment. But Jared Ransom said that he thought the sugar was likely to be scarce this season, seeing that so many folks was coming into the settlement, and so I concluded to take the bush on shears for this one spring. What's the best news, Judge, concerning ashes? Do pots hold so that a man can live by them still? I suppose they will, if they keep on fighting across the water." "Thou reasonest with judgment, William," returned Marmaduke. "So long as the old worm is to be convulsed with wars, so long will the harvest of America continue." "Well, it's an ill wind, Judge, that blows nobody any good. I'm sure the country is in a thriving way, and though I know you calculate greatly on the trees, setting as much store by them as some men would by their children, yet to my eyes they are a sore sight any time, unless I'm privileged to work my will on them, in which case I can't say but they are more to my liking. I have heard the settlers from the old countries say that their rich men keep great oaks and elms that would make a barrel of pots to the tree, standing round their doors and homesteads, and scattered over their farms, just to look at. Now I call no country much improved that is pretty well covered with trees. Stumps are a different thing, for they don't shade the land, and besides, you dig them, they make a fence that will turn anything bigger than a hog, being grand for breechy cattle." "Opinions on such subjects vary much in different countries," said Marmaduke, "but it is not as ornaments that I value the noble trees of this country. It is for their usefulness. We are stripping the forests, as if a single year would replace what we destroy. But the hour approaches when the laws will take notice of not only the woods, but the game they contain also." With this consoling reflection Marmaduke remounted, and the equestrians passed the sugar camp, on their way to the promised landscape of Richard. The wood chopper was left alone, in the bosom of the forest, to pursue his labors. Elizabeth turned her head when they reached the point where they were to descend the mountain, and thought that the slow fires that were glimmering under his enormous kettles, his little brush shelter, covered with pieces of hemlock bark, his gigantic size as he wielded his ladle with a steady and knowing air, aided by the background of stately trees, with their spouts and troughs, formed altogether no unreal picture of human life in its first stages of civilization. Perhaps whatever the scene possessed of a romantic character was not injured by the powerful tones of Kirby's voice ringing through the woods as he again awoke his strains to another tune, which was but little more scientific than the former. All that she understood of the words were, "And when the proud forest is falling, to my oxen cheerfully calling, from morn until night I am bawling, woe back there, and haw and gee, till our labor is mutually ended, by my strength and cattle befriended, and against the mosquitoes defended by the bark of the walnut trees. Away, then, you lads who would buy land, choose the oak that grows on the high land, or the silvery pine on the dry land, it matters but little to me." End of chapter 20. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 21 of The Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21. Speed, my liege, speed! Such cause of haste thine active sinews never braced. Scott. The roads of Otsego, if we except the principal highways, were, at the early day of our tale, but little better than wood paths. The high trees that were growing on the very verge of the wheel tracks excluded the sun's rays, unless at meridian, and the slowness of the evaporation, united with the rich mold of vegetable decomposition that covered the whole country to the depth of several inches, occasioned but an indifferent foundation for the footing of travelers. Added to these were the inequalities of a natural surface, and the constant recurrence of enormous and slippery roots that were laid bare by the removal of the light soil, together with stumps of trees, to make a passage not only difficult but dangerous. Yet the riders among these numerous obstructions, which were such as would terrify an unpractised eye, gave no demonstrations of uneasiness as their horses toiled through the sloughs or trotted with uncertain paces along the dark route. In many places the marks on the trees were the only indications of a road, with perhaps an occasional remnant of a pine that, by being cut close to the earth, so as to leave nothing visible but its base of roots, spreading for 20 feet in every direction, was apparently placed there as a beacon to warn the traveler that it was the center of a highway. Into one of these roads the active sheriff led the way, first striking out of the footpath by which they had descended from the sugar bush across a little bridge, formed of round logs laid loosely on sleepers of pine, in which large openings of a formidable width were frequent. The nag of Richard, when it reached one of these gaps, laid its nose along the logs and stepped across the difficult passage with the sagacity of a man. But the blooded filly which Miss Temple rode disdained so humble a movement. She made a step or two with an unusual caution, and then, on reaching the broadest opening, obedient to the curt and whip of her fearless mistress, she bounded across the dangerous pass with the activity of a squirrel. "Gently, gently, my child," said Marmaduke, who was following in the manner of Richard. "This is not a country for equestrian feats. Much prudence is requisite to journey through our rough paths with safety. Thou mayest practise thy skill in horsemanship on the plains of New Jersey with safety, but in the hills of Otsego they may be suspended for a time." "I may as well then relinquish my saddle at once, dear sir," returned his daughter, "for if it is to be laid aside until this wild country be improved, old age will overtake me, and put an end to what you term my equestrian feats." "Say not so, my child," returned her father; "but if thou venturest again, as in crossing this bridge, old age will never overtake thee, but I shall be left to mourn thee, cut off in thy prime, my Elizabeth." If thou hadst seen this district of country as I did when it lay in the sleep of nature, and had witnessed its rapid changes as it awoke to supply the wants of man, thou wouldst curb thy impatience for a little time, though thou shouldst not check thy steed. I recollect hearing you speak of your first visit to these woods, but the impression is faint, and blended with the confused images of childhood. Wild and unsettled as it may yet seem, it must have been 1,000 times more dreary then. Will you repeat, dear sir, what you then thought of your enterprise, and what you felt?" During this speech of Elizabeth, which was uttered with the fervor of affection, young Edwards rode more closely to the side of the Judge, and bent his dark eyes on his countenance with an expression that seemed to read his thoughts. "Thou wast then young, my child, but must remember when I left thee and thy mother to take my first survey of these uninhabited mountains," said Marmaduke. "But thou dost not feel all the secret motives that can urge a man to endure privations in order to accumulate wealth. In my case they have not been trifling, and God has been pleased to smile on my efforts. If I have encountered pain, famine, and disease in accomplishing the settlement of this rough territory, I have not the misery of failure to add to the grievances." "Famine!" echoed Elizabeth. "I thought this was the land of abundance. Had you famine to contend with?" "Even so, my child," said her father. "Those who look around them now, and see the loads of produce that issue out of every wild path in these mountains during the season of travelling, will hardly credit that no more than 5 years have elapsed since the tenants of these woods were compelled to eat the scanty fruits of the forest to sustain life, and, with their unpractised skill, to hunt the beasts as food for their starving families." "Ay," cried Richard, who happened to overhear the last of this speech between the notes of the woodchopper's song, which he was endeavoring to breathe aloud. "That was the starving time, Cousin Bess." Author's insertion. The author has no better apology for interrupting the interest of a work of fiction by these desultory dialogues than that they have reference to facts. In reviewing his work, after so many years, he is compelled to confess it is injured by too many allusions to incidents that are not at all suited to satisfy the just expectations of the general reader. One of these events is slightly touched on in the commencement of this chapter. End author's insertion. "I grew as lank as a weasel that fall, and my face was as pale as one of your fever and ague visages. Monsieur Le Quoi there fell away like a pumpkin in drying, nor do I think you have got fairly over it yet, monsieur. Benjamin, I thought, bore it with a worse grace than any of the family, for he swore it was harder to endure than a short allowance in the calm latitudes. Benjamin is a sad fellow to swear if you starve him ever so little. I had half a mind to quit you then, 'Duke, and to go into Pennsylvania to fatten. But damn it, thinks I, we are sisters' children, and I will live or die with him after all." More than 30 years since a very near and dear relative of the writer, an elder sister and a second mother, was killed by a fall from a horse in a ride among the very mountains mentioned in this tale. Few of her sex and years were more extensively known or more universally beloved than the admirable woman who thus fell a victim to the chances of the wilderness. "I do not forget thy kindness," said Marmaduke, "nor that we are of one blood." "But, my dear father," cried the wondering Elizabeth, "was there actual suffering? Where were the beautiful and fertile vales of the Mohawk? Could they not furnish food for your wants?" "It was a season of scarcity. The necessities of life commanded a high price in Europe, and were greedily sought after by the speculators. The emigrants from the east to the west invariably passed along the valley of the Mohawk, and swept away the means of subsistence like a swarm of locusts. Nor were the people on the flats in a much better condition. They were in want themselves, but they spared the little excess of provisions that nature did not absolutely require, with the justice of the German character. There was no grinding of the poor. The word speculator was then unknown to them. I have seen many a stout man bending under the load of the bag of meal which he was carrying from the mills of the Mohawk, through the rugged passes of these mountains, to feed his half-famished children, with a heart so light as he approached his hut that the 30 miles he had passed seemed nothing. Remember, my child, it was in our very infancy. We had neither mills, nor grain, nor roads, nor often clearings. We had nothing of increase but the mouths that were to be fed. For even at that inauspicious moment the restless spirit of emigration was not idle. Nay, the general scarcity which extended to the east tended to increase the number of adventurers. "And how, dearest father, didst thou encounter this dreadful evil?" said Elizabeth, unconsciously adopting the dialect of her parent in the warmth of her sympathy. "Upon thee must have fallen the responsibility, if not the suffering." "It did, Elizabeth," returned the Judge, pausing for a single moment, as if musing on his former feelings. "I had hundreds at that dreadful time daily looking up to me for bread. The sufferings of their families and the gloomy prospect before them had paralyzed the enterprise and efforts of my settlers. Hunger drove them to the woods for food, but despair sent them at night, enfeebled and wan, to a sleepless pillow. It was not a moment for inaction. I purchased cargoes of wheat from the granaries of Pennsylvania. They were landed at Albany, and brought up the Mohawk in boats. From thence it was transported on pack horses into the wilderness, and distributed among my people. Seines were made, and the lakes and rivers were dragged for fish. Something like a miracle was wrought in our favor, for enormous shoals of herrings were discovered to have wandered 500 miles through the windings of the impetuous Susquehanna, and the lake was alive with their numbers. These were at length caught and dealt out to the people, with proper portions of salt, and from that moment we again began to prosper. Author's insertion. All this was literally true. End author's insertion. "Yes," cried Richard, "and I was the man who served out the fish and salt. When the poor devils came to receive their rations, Benjamin, who was my deputy, was obliged to keep them off by stretching ropes around me, for they smelt so of garlic, from eating nothing but the wild onion, that the fumes put me out often in my measurement. You were a child then, Bess, and knew nothing of the matter, for great care was observed to keep both you and your mother from suffering. That year put me back dreadfully, both in the breed of my hogs and of my turkeys." "No, Bess," cried the Judge in a more cheerful tone, disregarding the interruption of his cousin. "He who hears the settlement of a country knows but little of the toil and suffering by which it is accomplished. Unimproved and wild as this district now seems to your eyes, what was it when I first entered the hills? I left my party the morning of my arrival near the farms of the Cherry Valley, and following a deer path, rode to the summit of the mountain that I have since called Mount Vision. For the sight that there met my eyes seemed to me as the deceptions of a dream. The fire had run over the pinnacle, and in a great measure laid open the view. The leaves were fallen, and I mounted a tree and sat for an hour looking on the silent wilderness. Not an opening was to be seen in the boundless forest, except where the lake lay, like a mirror of glass. The water was covered by myriads of the wildfowl that migrate with the changes in the season; and while in my situation on the branch of the beech, I saw a bear, with her cubs, descend to the shore to drink. I had met many deer, gliding through the woods, in my journey, but not the vestige of a man could I trace during my progress, nor from my elevated observatory. No clearing, no hut, none of the winding roads that are now to be seen, were there. Nothing but mountains rising behind mountains, and the valley, with its surface of branches enlivened here and there with the faded foliage of some tree that parted from its leaves with more than ordinary reluctance. Even the Susquehanna was then hid by the height and density of the forest. "And were you alone?" asked Elizabeth. "Passed you the night in that solitary state?" "Not so, my child," returned the father. "After musing on the scene for an hour, with a mingled feeling of pleasure and desolation, I left my perch and descended the mountain. My horse was left to browse on the twigs that grew within his reach, while I explored the shores of the lake and the spot where Templeton stands. A pine of more than ordinary growth stood where my dwelling is now placed. A windrow had been opened through the trees from thence to the lake, and my view was but little impeded. Under the branches of that tree I made my solitary dinner. I had just finished my repast, as I saw smoke curling from under the mountain, near the eastern bank of the lake. It was the only indication of the vicinity of man that I had then seen. After much toil I made my way to the spot, and found a rough cabin of logs, built against the foot of a rock, and bearing the marks of a tenant, though I found no one within it. "It was the hut of Leatherstocking," said Edwards quickly. It was, though I at first supposed it to be a habitation of the Indians. But while I was lingering around the spot, Natty made his appearance, staggering under the carcass of a buck that he had slain. Our acquaintance commenced at that time. Before, I had never heard that such a being tenanted the woods. He launched his bark canoe and set me across the foot of the lake to the place where I had fastened my horse, and pointed out a spot where he might get a scanty browsing until the morning, when I returned and passed the night in the cabin of the hunter. Miss Temple was so much struck by the deep attention of young Edwards during this speech, that she forgot to resume her interrogations, but the youth himself continued the discourse by asking, "And how did the Leatherstocking discharge the duties of a host, sir?" "Why, simply but kindly, until late in the evening, when he discovered my name and object, and the cordiality of his manner very sensibly diminished, or I might better say, disappeared. He considered the introduction of the settlers as an innovation on his rights, I believe, for he expressed much dissatisfaction at the measure, though it was in his confused and ambiguous manner. I hardly understood his objections myself, but supposed they referred chiefly to an interruption of the hunting." "Had you then purchased the estate, or were you examining it with an intent to buy?" asked Edwards, a little abruptly. "It had been mine for several years. It was with a view to people the land that I visited the lake. Natty treated me hospitably, but coldly, I thought, after he learned the nature of my journey. I slept on his own bearskin, however, and in the morning joined my surveyors again." "Said he nothing of the Indian rights, sir? The Leatherstocking is much given to impeach the justice of the tenure by which the whites hold the country." "I remember that he spoke of them, but I did not nearly comprehend him, and may have forgotten what he said; for the Indian title was extinguished so far back as the close of the old war, and if it had not been at all, I hold under the patents of the royal governors, confirmed by an act of our own State legislature, and no court in the country can affect my title." "Doubtless, sir, your title is both legal and equitable," returned the youth coldly, reining his horse back, and remaining silent till the subject was changed. It was seldom Mr. Jones suffered any conversation to continue for a great length of time without his participation. It seems that he was of the party that Judge Temple had designated as his surveyors, and he embraced the opportunity of the pause that succeeded the retreat of young Edwards to take up the discourse, and with a narration of their further proceedings after his own manner. As it wanted, however, the interest that had accompanied the description of the judge, we must decline the task of committing his sentences to paper. They soon reached the point where the promised view was to be seen. It was one of those picturesque and peculiar scenes that belong to the Otsego, but which required the absence of the ice and the softness of a summer's landscape to be enjoyed in all its beauty. Marmaduke had early forewarned his daughter of the season, and of its effect on the prospect; and after casting a cursory glance at its capabilities, the party returned homeward, perfectly satisfied that its beauties would repay them for the toil of a second ride at a more propitious season. "The spring is the gloomy time of the American year," said the Judge, "and it is more peculiarly the case in these mountains. The winter seems to retreat to the fastnesses of the hills, as to the citadel of its dominion, and is only expelled after a tedious siege, in which either party, at times, would seem to be gaining the victory." "A very just and apposite figure, Judge Temple," observed the sheriff, "and the garrison under the command of Jack Frost make formidable sorties. You understand what I mean by sorties, monsieur, sallies in English, and sometimes drive General Spring and his troops back again into the Low Countries." "Yes, sir," returned the Frenchman, whose prominent eyes were watching the precarious footsteps of the beast he rode, as it picked its dangerous way among the roots of trees, holes, log bridges, and sloughs that formed the aggregate of the highway. Je vous entends. The low country is freeze up for half the year." The error of Mr. Le Quoi was not noticed by the sheriff, and the rest of the party were yielding to the influence of the changeful season, which was already teaching the equestrians that a continuance of its mildness was not to be expected for any length of time. Silence and thoughtfulness succeeded the gaiety and conversation that had prevailed during the commencement of the ride, as clouds began to gather about the heavens, apparently collecting from every quarter, in quick motion, without the agency of a breath of air. While riding over one of the cleared eminencies that occurred in their route, the watchful eye of Judge Temple pointed out to his daughter the approach of a tempest. Flurries of snow already obscured the mountain that formed the northern boundary of the lake, and the genial sensation which had quickened the blood through their veins was already succeeded by the deadening influence of an approaching northwester. All of the party were now busily engaged in making the best of their way to the village, though the badness of the roads frequently compelled them to check the impatience of their animals, which often carried them over places that would not admit of any gait faster than a walk. Richard continued in advance, followed by Mr. Le Quoi, next to whom rode Elizabeth, who seemed to have imbibed the distance which pervaded the manner of young Edwards since the termination of the discourse between the latter and her father. Marmaduke followed his daughter, giving her frequent and tender warnings as to the management of her horse. It was, possibly, the evident dependence that Louisa Grant placed on his assistance, which induced the youth to continue by her side, as they pursued their way through a dreary and dark wood, where the rays of the sun could but rarely penetrate, and where even the daylight was obscured and rendered gloomy by the deep forests that surrounded them. No wind had yet reached the spot where the equestrians were in motion, but that dead silence that often precedes a storm contributed to render their situation more irksome than if they were already subject to the fury of the tempest. Suddenly the voice of young Edwards was heard shouting in those appalling tones that carry alarm to the very soul, and which curdle the blood of those that hear them. "A tree! A tree! Whip, spur for your lives! A tree! A tree! A tree! A tree!" echoed Richard, giving his horse a blow that caused the alarmed beast to jump nearly a rod, throwing the mud and water into the air like a hurricane. "Von tree! Von tree!" shouted the Frenchman, bending his body on the neck of his charger, shutting his eyes, and playing on the ribs of his beast with his heels at a rate that caused him to be conveyed on the crupper of the sheriff with a marvellous speed. Elizabeth checked her filly and looked up with an unconscious but alarmed air at the very cause of their danger, while she listened to the crackling sounds that awoke the stillness of the forest. But the next instant her bridlet was seized by her father, who cried, "God protect my child!" and she felt herself hurried onward, impelled by the vigor of his nervous arm. Each one of the party bowed to his saddle bows, as the tearing of the branches was succeeded by a sound like the rushing of the winds, which was followed by a thundering report, and a shock that caused the very earth to tremble, as one of the noblest ruins of the forest fell directly across their path. One glance was enough to assure Judge Temple that his daughter and those in front of him were safe, and he turned his eyes in dreadful anxiety to learn the fate of the others. Young Edwards was on the opposite side of the tree, his form thrown back in his saddle to its utmost distance, his left hand drawing up his bridle with its greatest force, while the right grasped that of Miss Grant so as to draw the head of her horse under its body. Both the animals stood shaking in every joint with terror, and snorting fearfully. Louisa herself had relinquished her reins, and with her hands pressed on her face, sat bending forward in her saddle, in an attitude of despair mingled strangely with resignation. "Are you safe?" cried the Judge, first breaking the awful silence of the moment. "By God's blessing," returned the youth; "but if there had been branches to the tree, we must have been lost." He was interrupted by the figure of Louisa slowly yielding in her saddle, and but for his arm she would have sunk to the earth. Terror, however, was the only injury that the clergyman's daughter had sustained, and with the aid of Elizabeth she was soon restored to her senses. After some little time was lost in recovering her strength, the young lady was replaced in her saddle, and, supported on either side by Judge Temple and Mr. Edwards, she was enabled to follow the party in their slow progress. "The sudden fallings of the trees," said Marmaduke, "are the most dangerous accidents in the forest, for they are not to be foreseen, being impelled by no winds, nor any extraneous or visible cause against which we can guard." "Their reason for their falling, Judge Temple, is very obvious," said the sheriff. "The tree is old and decayed, and it is gradually weakened by the frosts until a line drawn from the center of gravity falls without its base, and then the tree comes of a certainty. And I should like to know what greater compulsion there can be for anything than a mathematical certainty. I studied math—" "Very true, Richard," interrupted Marmaduke, "thy reasoning is true, and, if my memory be not over treacherous, was furnished by myself on a former occasion. But how is one to guard against the danger? Canst thou go through the forests, measuring the bases and calculating the centers of the oaks? Answer me that, friend Jones, and I will say thou wilt do the country a service." "Answer thee that, friend Temple," returned Richard. "A well-educated man can answer thee anything, sir. Do any trees fall in this manner but such as are decayed? Take care not to approach the roots of a rotten tree, and you will be safe enough." "That would be excluding us entirely from the forests," said Marmaduke. "But happily the winds usually force down most of these dangerous ruins, as their currents are admitted into the woods by the surrounding clearings, and such a fall as this has been is very rare." Louisa by this time had recovered so much strength as to allow the party to proceed at a quicker pace, but long before they were safely housed they were overtaken by the storm, and when they dismounted at the door of the mansion house, the black plumes of Miss Temple's hat were drooping with the weight of a load of damp snow, and the coats of the gentlemen were powdered with the same material. While Edwards was assisting Louisa from her horse, the warm-hearted girl caught his hand with fervor, and whispered, "Now, Mr. Edwards, both father and daughter owe their lives to you." A driving northwesterly storm succeeded, and before the sun was set every vestige of spring had vanished, the lake, the mountains, the village, and the fields being again hidden under one dazzling coat of snow. Chapter 21. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 22 of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 22. Men, boys, and girls desert the unpeopled village, and wild crowds spread o'er the plain, by the sweet frenzy driven. Somerville. From this time to the close of April, the weather continued to be a succession of neat and rapid changes. One day the soft airs of spring seemed to be stealing along the valley, and in unison with an invigorating sun, attempting covertly to rouse the dormant powers of the vegetable world, while, on the next, the surly blasts from the north would sweep across the lake and erase every impression left by their gentle adversaries. The snow, however, finally disappeared, and the green wheat fields were seen in every direction, spotted with the dark and charred stumps that had, the preceding season, supported some of the proudest trees of the forest. Ploughs were in motion, wherever those useful implements could be used, and the smokes of the sugar camps were no longer seen issuing from the woods of maple. The lake had lost the beauty of a field of ice, but still a dark and gloomy covering concealed its waters, for the absence of currents left them yet hidden under a porous crust, which, saturated with the fluid, barely retained enough strength to preserve the continuity of its parts. Large flocks of wild geese were seen passing over the country, which hovered for a time around the hidden sheet of water, apparently searching for a resting place, and then, on finding themselves excluded by the chill covering, would soar away to the north, filling the air with discordant screams, as if venting their complaints at the tardy operations of nature. For a week, the dark covering of the Otsego was left to the undisturbed possession of two eagles, who alighted on the center of its field and sat eyeing their undisputed territory. During the presence of these monarchs of the air, the flocks of migrating birds avoided crossing the plain of ice by turning into the hills, apparently seeking the protection of the forests, while the white and bald heads of the tenants of the lake were turned upward with a look of contempt. But the time had come when even these kings of birds were to be dispossessed. An opening had been gradually increasing at the lower extremity of the lake, and around the dark spot where the current of the river prevented the formation of ice during even the coldest weather; and the fresh southerly winds that now breathed freely upon the valley made an impression on the waters. Mimic waves began to curl over the margin of the frozen field, which exhibited an outline of crystallizations that slowly receded toward the north. At each step the power of the winds and the waves increased, until, after a struggle of a few hours, the turbulent little billows succeeded in setting the whole field in motion, when it was driven beyond the reach of the eye, with a rapidity that was as magical as the change produced in the scene by this expulsion of the lingering remnant of winter. Just as the last sheet of agitated ice was disappearing in the distance, the eagles rose, and soared with a wide sweep above the clouds, while the waves tossed their little caps of snow in the air, as if rioting in their release from a thraldom of 5 minutes' duration. The following morning Elizabeth was awakened by the exhilarating sounds of the martins, who were quarrelling and chattering around the little boxes suspended above her windows, and the cries of Richard, who was calling in tones animating as signs of the season itself. "Awake, awake, my fair lady! The gulls are hovering over the lake already, and the heavens are alive with pigeons. You may look an hour before you can find a hole through which to get a peep at the sun. Awake, awake, lazy ones! Benjamin is overhauling the ammunition, and we only wait for our breakfasts, and away for the mountains and pigeon shooting." There was no resisting this animated appeal, and in a few minutes Miss Temple and her friend descended to the parlor. The doors of the hall were thrown open, and the mild, balmy air of a clear spring morning was ventilating the apartment, where the vigilance of the ex-steward had been so long maintaining an artificial heat with such unremitted diligence. The gentlemen were impatiently waiting for their morning's repast, each equipped in the garb of a sportsman. Mr. Jones made many visits to the southern door, and would cry, "See, Cousin Bess, see! Duke, the pigeon roosts of the south have broken up. They are growing more thick every instant. Here is a flock that the eye cannot see the end of. There is food enough in it to keep the army of Xerxes for a month, and feathers enough to make beds for the whole country." Xerxes, Mr. Edwards, was a Grecian king who— no, he was a Turk, or a Persian, who wanted to conquer Greece, just the same as these rascals will overrun our wheat fields, when they come back in the fall. Away, away! Bess, I long to pepper them." In this wish both Marmaduke and young Edwards seemed equally to participate, for the sight was exhilarating to a sportsman, and the ladies soon dismissed the party after a hasty breakfast. If the heavens were alive with pigeons, the whole village seemed equally in motion with men, women, and children. Every species of firearm, from the French ducking gun, with a barrel near 6 feet in length, to the common horseman's pistol, was to be seen in the hands of the men and boys; while bows and arrows, some made of the simple stick of walnut sapling, and others in a rude imitation of the ancient crossbows, were carried by many of the latter. The houses and the signs of life apparent in the village drove the alarmed birds from the direct line of their flight, toward the mountains, along the sides and near the bases of which they were glancing in dense masses, equally wonderful by the rapidity of their motion and their incredible numbers. We have already said that, across the inclined plane which fell from the steep ascent of the mountain to the banks of the Susquehanna, ran the highway on either side of which a clearing of many acres had been made at a very early day. Over those clearings, and up the eastern mountain, and along the dangerous path that was cut into its side, the different individuals posted themselves, and in a few moments the attack commenced. Among the sportsmen was the tall, gaunt form of Leatherstocking, walking over the field, with his rifle hanging on his arm, his dogs at his heels; the latter now scenting the dead or wounded birds that were beginning to tumble from the flocks, and then crouching under the legs of their master, as if they participated in his feelings at this wasteful and unsportsmanlike execution. The reports of the firearms became rapid, whole volleys rising from the plain, as flocks of more than ordinary numbers darted over the opening, shadowing the field like a cloud, and then the light smoke of a single piece would issue from among the leafless bushes on the mountain, as death was hurled on the retreat of the affrighted birds, who were rising from a volley, in a vain effort to escape. Arrows and missiles of every kind were in the midst of the flocks, and so numerous were the birds, and so low did they take their flight, that even long poles in the hands of those on the sides of the mountain were used to strike them to the earth. During all this time, Mr. Jones, who disdained the humble and ordinary means of destruction used by his companions, was busily occupied, aided by Benjamin, in making arrangements for an assault of more than ordinarily fatal character. Among the relics of the old military excursions that occasionally are discovered throughout the different districts of the western part of New York, there had been found in Templeton, at its settlement, a small swivel, which would carry a ball of a pound weight. It was thought to have been deserted by a war party of the whites in one of their inroads into the Indian settlements, when perhaps convenience or their necessity induced them to leave such an encumbrance behind them in the woods. This miniature cannon had been released from the rust, and being mounted on little wheels was now in a state for actual service. For several years it was the sole organ for extraordinary rejoicings used in those mountains. On the mornings of the 4th of July it would be heard ringing among the hills, and even Captain Hollister, who was the highest authority in that part of the country on all such occasions, affirmed that, considering its dimensions, it was no despicable gun for a salute. It was somewhat the worse for the service it had performed, it is true, there being but a trifling difference in size between the touch-hole and the muzzle. Still, the grand conceptions of Richard had suggested the importance of such an instrument in hurling death at his nimble enemies. The swivel was dragged by a horse into a part of the open space that the sheriff thought most eligible for planning a battery of the kind, and Mr. Pump proceeded to load it. Several handfuls of duck-shot were placed on top of the powder, and the major domo announced that his piece was ready for service. The sight of such an implement collected all the idle spectators to the spot, who, being mostly boys, filled the air with cries of exultation and delight. The gun was pointed high, and Richard, holding a coal of fire in a pair of tongs, patiently took his seat on a stump, awaiting the appearance of a flock worthy of his notice. So prodigious was the number of the birds that the scattering fire of the guns, with the hurling of missiles and the cries of the boys, had no other effect than to break off small flocks from the immense masses that continued to dart along the valley, as if the whole of the feathered tribe were pouring through that one pass. None pretended to collect the game, which lay scattered over the fields in such profusion as to cover the very ground with fluttering victims. Leatherstocking was a silent but uneasy spectator of all these proceedings, but was able to keep his sentiments to himself until he saw the introduction of the swivel into the sports. "This comes of settling a country," he said. "Here I have known the pigeon to fly for 40 long years, and, till you made your clearings, there was nobody to skeert or to hurt them. I loved to see them come into the woods, for they were company to a body, hurting nothing, being, as it was, as harmless as a garter snake. But now it gives me sore thoughts when I hear the frighty things whizzing through the air, for I know it's only a motion to bring out all the brats of the village. Well, the Lord won't see the waste of his creatures for nothing, and right will be done to the pigeons, as well as others, by and by. There's Mr. Oliver as bad as the rest of them, firing into the flocks as if he was shooting down nothing but Mingo warriors." Among the sportsmen was Billy Kirby, who, armed with an old musket, was loading, and, without even looking into the air, was firing and shouting as his victims fell even on his own person. He heard the speech of Natty, and took upon himself to reply. "What, old Leatherstocking," he cried, "grumbling at the loss of a few pigeons? If you had to sow your wheat twice and 3 times, as I have done, you wouldn't be so massifully feeling toward the devils. Hurrah, boys! Scatter the feathers. This is better than shooting at a turkey's head and neck, old fellow." "It's better for you, maybe, Billy Kirby," replied the indignant old hunter, and all them that don't know how to put a ball down a rifle barrel, or how to bring it up again with a true aim. But it's wicked to be shooting into flocks in this wasty manner, and none to do it who know how to knock over a single bird. If a body has a craving for pigeon's flesh, why, it's made the same as all other creatures, for man's eating, but not to kill 20 and eat one. When I want such a thing, I go into the woods till I find one to my liking, and then I shoot him off the branches, without touching the feather of another, though there might be 100 on the same tree. You couldn't do such a thing, Billy Kirby. You couldn't do it if you tried." "What's that, old cornstalk, you sapless stub?" cried the woodchopper. "You have grown wordy since the affair of the turkey; but if you are for a single shot, here goes at that bird which comes on by himself." The fire from the distant part of the field had driven a single pigeon below the flock to which it belonged, and, frightened with the constant reports of the muskets, it was approaching the spot where the disputants stood, darting first from one side and then to the other, cutting the air with the swiftness of lightning, and making a noise with its wings not unlike the rushing of a bullet. Unfortunately for the woodchopper, notwithstanding his vaunt, he did not see this bird until it was too late to fire as it approached, and he pulled the trigger at the unlucky moment, when it was darting immediately over his head. The bird continued its course with the usual velocity. Natty lowered his rifle from his arm when the challenge was made, and, waiting a moment until the terrified victim had got in a line with his eye, and had dropped near the bank of the lake, he raised it again with uncommon rapidity, and fired. It might have been chance, or it might have been skill, that produced the result. It was probably a union of both, but the pigeon whirled over in the air, and fell into the lake with a broken wing. At the sound of his rifle, both his dogs started from his feet, and in a few minutes the slut brought out the bird still alive. The wonderful exploit of Leatherstocking was noised through the field with great rapidity, and the sportsmen gathered in, to learn the truth of the report. "What," said young Edwards, "have you really killed a pigeon on the wing, Natty, with a single ball?" "Haven't I killed loons before now, lad, that dive at the flash?" returned the hunter. "It's much better to kill only such as you want, without wasting your powder and lead, than to be firing into God's creatures in this wicked manner. But I came out for a bird, and you know the reason why I like small game, Mr. Oliver, and now I have got one, 'twill go home, for I don't relish to see these wasty ways that you are all practising, as if the least thing wasn't made for use, and not to destroy." "Thou sayest well, Leatherstocking," cried Marmaduke, "and I begin to think it time to put an end to this work of destruction." "Put an end, Judge, to your clearings. Ain't the woods his work as well as the pigeons? Use, but don't waste. Wasn't the woods made for the beasts and birds to harbor in? And when man wanted their flesh, their skins, or their feathers, there's the place to seek them. But I'll go to the hut with my own game, for I wouldn't touch one of the harmless things that cover the ground here, looking up with their eyes on me, as if they only wanted tongues to say their thoughts." With this sentiment in his mouth, Leatherstocking threw his rifle over his arm, and, followed by his dogs, stepped across the clearing with great caution, taking care not to tread on one of the wounded birds in his path. He soon entered the bushes on the margin of the lake, and was hid from view. Whatever impression the morality of Natty made on the Judge, it was utterly lost on Richard. He availed himself of the gathering of the sportsmen to lay a plan for one fell swoop of destruction. The musketmen were drawn up in battle array, in a line extending on each side of his artillery, with orders to await the signal of firing from himself. "Stand by, my lads," said Benjamin, who acted as an aide-de-camp on this occasion. "Stand by, my hearties, and when Squire Dickens heaves out the signal to begin firing, d'ye see, you may open upon them in a broadside. Take care and fire low, boys, and you'll be sure to hold the flock." "Fire low!" shouted Kirby. "Hear the old fool! If we fire low, we may hit the stumps, but not ruffle a pigeon." "How should you know, you lubber?" cried Benjamin, with a very unbecoming heat for an officer on the eve of battle. "How should you know, you grampus? Haven't I sailed aboard of the Boadicea for 5 years, and wasn't it a standing order to fire low and to hull your enemy? Keep silence at your guns, boys, and mind the order that is passed." The loud laughs of the musketmen were silenced by the more authoritative voice of Richard, who called for attention and obedience to his signals. Some millions of pigeons were supposed to have already passed that morning over the valley of Templeton, but nothing like the flock that was now approaching had been seen before. It extended from mountain to mountain in one solid blue mass, and the eye looked in vain over the southern hills to find its termination. The front of this living column was distinctly marked by a line, but very slightly indented, so regular and even was the flight. Even Marmaduke forgot the morality of Leatherstocking as it approached, and in common with the rest brought his musket to a poise. "Fire!" cried the sheriff, clapping a coal to the priming of the cannon. As half of Benjamin's charge escaped through the touch-hole, the whole volley of the musketry preceded the report of the swivel. On receiving this united discharge of small arms, the front of the flock darted upward, while at the same instant myriads of those in the rear rushed with amazing rapidity into their places, so that when the column of white smoke gushed from the mouth of the little cannon, an accumulated mass of objects was gliding over its point of direction. The roar of the gun echoed along the mountains, and died away to the north like distant thunder, while the whole flock of alarmed birds seemed for a moment thrown into one disorderly and agitated mass. The air was filled with their irregular flight, layer rising above layer, far above the tops of the highest pines, none daring to advance beyond the dangerous pass, when suddenly some of the headers of the feathered tribes shot across the valley, taking their flight directly over the village, and hundreds of thousands in their rear followed the example, deserting the eastern side of the plain to their persecutors and the slain. "Victory!" shouted Richard. "Victory! We have driven the enemy from the field." "Not so, Dickon," said Marmaduke. "The field is covered with them, and, like the Leatherstocking, I see nothing but eyes in every direction, as the innocent sufferers turn their heads in terror. Full one half of those that have fallen are yet alive, and I think it is time to end the sport, if sport it be." "Sport!" cried the sheriff. "It is princely sport. There are some thousands of the blue-coated boys on the ground, so that every old woman in the village may have a pot-pie for the asking." "Well, we have happily frightened the birds from this side of the valley," said Marmaduke, "and the carnage must of necessity end for the present. Boys, I will give you 6 pence a hundred for the pigeons' heads only, so go to work, and bring them into the village." This expedient produced the desired effect, for every urchin on the ground went industriously to work to wring the necks of the wounded birds. Judge Temple retired toward his dwelling with that kind of feeling that many a man has experienced before him, who discovers, after the excitement of the moment has passed, that he has purchased pleasure at the price of misery to others. Horses were loaded with the dead, and after this first burst of sporting, the shooting of pigeons became a business, with a few idlers, for the remainder of the season. Richard, however, boasted for many a year of his shot with the cricket, and Benjamin gravely asserted that he thought they had killed nearly as many pigeons on that day as there were Frenchmen destroyed on the memorable occasion of Rodney's victory. Chapter 22. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 23. Of the Pioneers, or The Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 23. "Help, masters, help! There's a fish hangs in the net, like a poor man's right in the law." Pericles of Tyre. The advance of the season now became as rapid as its first approach had been tedious and lingering. The days were uniformly mild, while the nights, though cool, were no longer chilled by frosts. The whippoorwill was heard whistling his melancholy notes along the margin of the lake, and the ponds and meadows were sending forth the music of their thousand tenants. The leaf of the native poplar was seen quivering in the woods. The sides of the mountains began to lose their hue of brown as the lively green of the different members of the forest blended their shades with the permanent colors of the pine and hemlock. and even the buds of the tardy oak were swelling with the promise of the coming summer. The gay and fluttering bluebird, the social robin, and the industrious little wren were all to be seen enlivening the fields with their presence and their songs, while the soaring fish-hawk was already hovering over the waters of the Otsego, watching with native voracity for the appearance of his prey. The tenants of the lake were far famed for both their quantities and their quality, and the ice had hardly disappeared before numberless little boats were launched from the shores, and the lines of the fishermen were dropped into the inmost recesses of its deepest caverns, tempting the unwary animals with every variety of bait that the ingenuity or the art of man had invented. But the slow though certain adventures with hook and line were ill suited to the profusion and impatience of the settlers. More destructive means were resorted to, and, as the season had now arrived when the bass fisheries were allowed by the provisions of the law that Judge Temple had procured, the sheriff declared his intention, by availing himself of the first dark night, to enjoy the sport in person. "And you shall be present, Cousin Bess," he added, when he announced this design, "and Miss Grant, and Mr. Edwards, and I will show you what I call fishing, not nibble, 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 as 'Duke does when he goes after the salmon trout. There he will sit for hours in a broiling sun, or perhaps over a hole in the lee, in the coldest days in winter, under the lee of a few bushes, and not a fish will he catch, after all this mortification of the flesh. No, no, give me a good seine that's 50 or 60 fathoms in length, with a jolly parcel of boatmen to crack their jokes the while, with Benjamin to steer, and let us haul them in by thousands. I call that fishing." "Ah, Dickon," cried Marmaduke, "thou knowest but little of the pleasure there is in playing with the hook and line, or thou wouldst be more saving of the game. I have known thee to leave fragments enough behind thee, when thou hast headed a night party on the lake, to feed a dozen famishing families." "I shall not dispute the matter, Judge Temple. This night will I go, and I invite the company to attend, and then let them decide between us." Richard was busy during most of the afternoon, making his preparations for the important occasion. Just as the light of the settling sun had disappeared, and a new moon had begun to throw its shadows on the earth, the fishermen took their departure, in a boat, for a point that was situated on the western shore of the lake, at the distance of rather more than half a mile from the village. The ground had become settled, and the walking was good and dry. Marmaduke, with his daughter, her friend, and young Edwards, continued on the high grassy banks at the outlet of the placid sheet of water, watching the dark object that was moving across the lake, until it entered the shade of the western hills, and was lost to the eye. The distance round by land to the point of destination was a mile, and he observed, "It is time for us to be moving. The moon will be down ere we reach the point, and then the miraculous hauls of Dickon will commence." The evening was warm, and after the long and dreary winter from which they had just escaped, delightfully invigorating. Inspirited by the scene and their anticipated amusement, the youthful companions of the Judge followed his steps, as he led them along the shores of the Otsego, and through the skirts of the village. "See," said young Edwards, "they are building their fire already. It glimmers for a moment, and dies again like the light of a firefly." "Now it blazes," cried Elizabeth. "You can perceive figures moving around the light. Oh, I would bet my jewels against the gold beads of Remarkable that my impatient cousin Dickon had an agency in raising that bright flame. And see, it fades again, like most of his brilliant schemes." "Thou hast guessed the truth, Bess," said her father. "He has thrown an armful of brush on the pile, which has burnt out as soon as lighted. But it has enabled them to find a better fuel, for their fire begins to blaze with a more steady flame. It is the true fisherman's beacon now. Observe how beautifully it throws its little circle of light on the water." The appearance of the fire urged the pedestrians on, for even the ladies had become eager to witness the miraculous draught. By the time they reached the bank, which rose above the low point where the fishermen had landed, the moon had sunk behind the top of the western pines, and, as most of the stars were obscured by clouds, there was but little other light than that which proceeded from the fire. At the suggestion of Marmaduke, his companions paused to listen to the conversation of those below them, and examine the party for a moment before they descended to the shore. The whole group were seated around the fire, with the exception of Richard and Benjamin, the former of whom occupied the root of a decayed stump that had been drawn to the spot as part of their fuel, and the latter was standing with his arms akimbo, so near to the flame that the smoke occasionally obscured his solemn visage, as it waved around the pile in obedience to the night airs that swept gently over the water. "Why, look you, squire," said the major domo, "you may call a lake fish that will weigh 20 or 30 pounds a serious matter, but to a man who has hauled in a shovel-nosed shirk, d'ye see, it's but a poor kind of fishing after all." "I don't know, Benjamin," returned the sheriff. "A haul of 1,000 Otsego bass, without counting pike, pickerel, perch, bullpouts, salmon trouts, and suckers, is no bad fishing, let me tell you. There may be sport in sticking a shark, but what is he good for after you have got him? Now, any one of the fish that I have named is fit to set before a king." "Well, squire," returned Benjamin, "just listen to the philosophy of the thing. Would it stand to reason that such a fish should live and be catched in this here little pond of water, where it's hardly deep enough to drown a man, as you'll find in the wide ocean, where, as everybody knows, that is, everybody that has followed the seas, whales and grampuses are to be seen, that are as long as one of the pine trees on yonder mountain?" "Softly, softly, Benjamin," said the sheriff, as if he wished to save the credit of his favorite. "Why, some of the pines will measure 200 feet, and even more." 200 or 2,000, it's all the same thing," cried Benjamin, with an air which manifested that he was not easily to be bullied out of his opinion on a subject like the present. "Haven't I been there, and haven't I seen? I have said that you fall in with whales as long as one of them there pines, and what I have once said I'll stand to." During this dialogue, which was evidently but the close of much longer discussion, the huge frame of Billy Kirby was seen extended on one side of the fire, where he was picking his teeth with splinters of the chips near him, and occasionally shaking his head with distrust of Benjamin's assertions. "I've a notion," said the woodchopper, "that there's water in this lake to swim the biggest whale that ever was invented; and as to the pines, I think I ought to know something consarning them. I have chopped many a one that was 60 times the length of my helve, without counting the eye; and I believe, Benny, that if the old pine that stands in the hollow of the Vision Mountain just over the village, you may see the tree itself by looking up, for the moon is on its top yet. Well, now I believe, if that same tree was planted out in the deepest part of the lake, there would be water enough for the biggest ship that ever was built to float over it, without touching its upper branches, I do." "Did ye ever see a ship, Master Kirby?" roared the steward. "Did ye ever see a ship, man, or any craft bigger than a lime scow, or a wood boat, on this here small bit of fresh water?" "Yes, I have," said the woodchopper stoutly. "I can say that I have, and tell no lie." "Did ye ever see a British ship, Master Kirby, an English line of battle ship, boy? Where did ye ever fall in with a regular built vessel, with starn post, and cutwater, garboard streak, and plank sheer, gangways, and hatchways, and waterways, quarter-deck, and forecastle, ay, and flush-deck? Tell me that, man, if you can. Where away did ye ever fall in with a full-rigged, regular-built, necked vessel?" The whole company were a good deal astounded with this overwhelming question, and even Richard afterward remarked that it was 1,000 pities that Benjamin could not read, or he must have made a valuable officer to the British marine. It is no wonder that they overcame the French so easily on the water, when even the lowest sailor so well understood the different parts of a vessel. But Billy Kirby was a fearless wight, and had great jealousy of foreign dictation. He had risen on his feet, and turned his back to the fire, during the valuable delivery of this interrogatory, and when the steward ended, contrary to all expectation, he gave the following spirited reply: "Where? Why, on the North River, and maybe on Champlain. There's sloops on the river, boy, that would give a hard time on it to the stoutest vessel King George owns." They carry masts of 90 feet in the clear of good solid pine, for I've been at the chopping of many a one in Varmount State. I wish I was captain in one of them, and you was in that board dish that you talk so much about, and we'd soon see what good Yankee stuff is made on, and whether a Vermonter's hide ain't as thick as an Englishman's." The echoes from the opposite hills, which were more than half a mile from the fishing point, sent back the discordant laugh that Benjamin gave forth at this challenge, and the woods that covered their sides seemed, by the noise that issued from their shades, to be full of mocking demons. "Let us descend to the shore," whispered Marmaduke, "or there will soon be ill blood between them. Benjamin is a fearless boaster, and Kirby, though good-natured, is a careless son of the forest, who thinks one American more than a match for 6 Englishmen. I marvel that Dickon is silent, where there is such a trial of skill in the superlative." The appearance of Judge Temple and the ladies produced, if not a pacification, at least a cessation of hostilities. Obedient to the directions of Mr. Jones, the fishermen prepared to launch their boat, which had been seen in the background of the view, with the net carefully disposed on a little platform in its stern, ready for service. Richard gave vent to his reproaches at the tardiness of the pedestrians, when all the turbulent passions of the party were succeeded by a calm, as mild and as placid as that which prevailed over the beautiful sheet of water that they were about to rifle of its best treasures. The night had now become so dark as to render objects without the reach of the light of the fire not only indistinct, but in most cases invisible. For a little distance the water was discernible, glistening, as the glare from the fire danced over its surface, touching it here and there with red quivering streaks. But at 100 feet from the shore there lay a boundary of impenetrable gloom. 1 or 2 stars were shining through the openings of the clouds, and the lights were seen in the village, glimmering faintly, as if at an immeasurable distance. At times, as the fire lowered, or as the horizon cleared, the outline of the mountain, on the other side of the lake, might be traced by its undulations, but its shadow was cast, wide and dense, on the bosom of the water, rendering the darkness in that direction trebly deep. Benjamin Pump was invariably the coxswain and net-caster of Richard's boat, unless the sheriff saw fit to preside in person, and on the present occasion Billy Kirby and a youth of about half his strength were assigned to the oars. The remainder of the assistants were stationed at the drag ropes. The arrangements were speedily made, and Richard gave the signal to shove off. Elizabeth watched the motion of the batteau as it pulled from the shore, letting loose its rope as it went, but it soon disappeared in the darkness, when the ear was her only guide to its evolutions. There was great affectation of stillness during all these manoeuvres, in order, as Richard assured them, not to frighten the bass who were running into the shoal waters, and who would approach the light if not disturbed by the sounds from the fishermen. The hoarse voice of Benjamin was alone heard issuing out of the gloom, as he uttered in authoritative tones, "Pull larboard oar! Pull starboard! Give way together, boys!" and such other indicative mandates as were necessary for the right disposition of his seine. A long time was passed in this necessary part of the process, for Benjamin prided himself greatly on his skill in throwing the net, and in fact most of the success of the sport depended on its being done with judgment. At length a loud splash in the water, as he threw away the staff or stretcher, with a hoarse call from the steward of clear, announced that the boat was returning, when Richard seized a brand from the fire, and ran to a point as far above the centre of the fishing ground as the one from which the batteau had started was below it. "Stick her in dead for the squire, boys," said the steward, "and we'll have a look at what grows in this here pond." In place of the falling net were now to be heard the quick strokes of the oars, and the noise of the rope running out of the boat. Presently the batteau shot into the circle of light, and in an instant she was pulled to the shore. Several eager hands were extended to receive the line, and both ropes being equally well manned, the fishermen commenced hauling in with slow and steady drags, Richard standing to the centre, giving orders, first to one party and then to the other, to increase or slacken their efforts, as occasion required. The visitors were posted near him, and enjoyed a fair view of the whole operation, which was slowly advancing to an end. Opinions as to the result of their adventure were now freely hazarded by all the men, some declaring that the net came in as light as a feather, and others affirming that it seemed to be full of logs. As the ropes were many hundred feet in length, these opposing sentiments were thought to be of little moment by the sheriff, who would go first to one line and then to the other, giving each small pulls, in order to enable him to form an opinion for himself. "Why, Benjamin," he cried, as he made his first effort in this way, "you did not throw the net clear. I can move it with my little finger. The rope slackens in my hand." "Did you ever see a whale, squire?" responded the steward. "I say that, if that there net is foul, the devil is in the lake in the shape of a fish, for I cast it as far as ever rigging was rove over the quarter deck of a flagship." But Richard discovered his mistake when he saw Billy Kirby before him, standing with his feet in the water, at an angle of 45 degrees, inclining southward, and expending his gigantic strength in sustaining himself in that posture. He ceased his remonstrances, and proceeded to the party at the other line. "I see the staffs!" shouted Mr. Jones. "Gather in, boys, and away with it! To shore with her! To shore with her!" At this cheerful sound, Elizabeth strained her eyes and saw the ends of the two sticks on the seine emerging from the darkness, while the men closed near to each other and formed a deep bag of their net. The exertions of the fishermen sensibly increased, and the voice of Richard was heard encouraging them to make their greatest efforts at the present moment. "Now's the time, my lads," he cried. "Let us get the ends to land, and all we have will be our own. Away with her!" "Away with her it is!" echoed Benjamin. "Hurrah! Ho-a-hay! Ho-a-hay! Ho-ah! In with her!" shouted Kirby, exerting himself in a manner that left nothing for those in his rear to do but to gather up the slack of the rope which passed through his hands. "Staff ho!" shouted the steward. "Staff ho!" echoed Kirby from the other rope. The men rushed to the water's edge, some seizing the upper rope and some the lower or lead rope, and began to haul with great activity and zeal. A deep semicircular sweep of the little balls that supported the seine in its perpendicular position was plainly visible to the spectators, and as it rapidly lessened in size, the bag of the net appeared, while an occasional flutter on the water announced the uneasiness of the prisoners it contained. "Haul in, my lads!" shouted Richard. "I can see the dogs kicking to get free. Haul in, and here's a cast that will pay for the labor." Fishes of various sorts were now to be seen, entangled in the meshes of the net, as it was passed through the hands of the laborers; and the water, at a little distance from the shore, was alive with the movements of the alarmed victims. Hundreds of white sides were glancing up to the surface of the water, and glistening in the firelight, when, frightened at the uproar and the change, the fish would again dart to the bottom in fruitless efforts for freedom. "Hurrah!" shouted Richard. "One or two more heavy drags, boys, and we are safe." "Cheerily, boys, cheerily!" cried Benjamin. "I see a salmon trout that is big enough for a chowder." "Away with you, varmints," said Billy Kirby, plucking a bullpout from the meshes, and casting the animal back into the lake with contempt. "Pull, boys, pull! Here's all kinds, and the Lord condemn me for a liar if there ain't 1,000 bass." Inflamed beyond the bounds of discretion at the sight, and forgetful of the season, the wood chopper rushed to his middle into the water, and began to drive the reluctant animals before him from their native element. "Pull heartily, boys!" cried Marmaduke, yielding to the excitement of the moment, and laying his hands to the net with no trifling addition to the force. Edwards had preceded him, for the sight of the immense piles of fish that were slowly rolling over on the gravelly beach had impelled him also to leave the ladies and join the fishermen. Great care was observed in bringing the net to land, and after much toil the whole shoal of victims was safely deposited in a hollow of the bank, where they were left to flutter away their brief existence in the new and fatal element. Even Elizabeth and Louisa were greatly excited and highly gratified by seeing 2,000 captives thus drawn from the bosom of the lake, and laid prisoners at their feet. But when the feelings of the moment were passing away, Marmaduke took in his hands a bass that might have weighed 2 pounds, and after viewing it a moment, in melancholy musing, he turned to his daughter and observed, "This is a fearful expenditure of the choicest gifts of Providence. These fish, Bess, which thou seest lying in such piles before thee, and which by tomorrow evening will be rejected food on the meanest table in Templeton, are of a quality and flavor that, in other countries, would make them esteemed a luxury on the tables of princes or epicures. The world has no better fish than the bass of Otsego. It unites the richness of the shad to the firmness of the salmon. Author's insertion: of all the fish the writer has ever tasted, he thinks the one in question the best." End author's insertion. "But surely, dear sir," cried Elizabeth, "they must prove a great blessing to the country, and a powerful friend to the poor." "The poor are always prodigal, my child, where there is plenty, and seldom think of a provision against the morrow. But if there can be any excuse for destroying animals in this manner, it is in taking the bass. During the winter, you know, they are entirely protected from our assaults by the ice, for they refuse the hook, and during the hot months they are not seen. It is supposed they retreat to the deep and cool waters of the lake at that season, and it is only in the spring and autumn that for a few days they are to be found around the points where they are within the reach of a seine. But, like all the other treasures of the wilderness, they already begin to disappear before the wasteful extravagance of man." "Disappear, 'Duke, disappear!" exclaimed the sheriff. "If you don't call this appearing, I know not what you will. Here are a good 1,000 of the shiners, some hundreds of suckers, and a powerful quantity of other fry. But this is always the way with you, Marmaduke. First it's the trees, then it's the deer, after that it's the maple sugar, and so on to the end of the chapter. One day you talk of canals through a country where there's a river or a lake every half-mile, just because the water won't run the way you wish it to go, and the next you say something about mines of coal, though any man who has good eyes like myself, I say with good eyes, can see more wood than would keep the city of London in fuel for 50 years. Wouldn't it, Benjamin?" "Why, for that, squire," said the steward, "London is no small place. If it was stretched on end, all the same as a town on one side of the river, it would cover some such matter as this here lake; though if I dares to say that the wood in sight might serve them a good turn, seeing that the Londoners mainly burn coal." "Now we are on the subject of coal, Judge Temple," interrupted the sheriff, "I have a thing of much importance to communicate to you, but I will defer it until tomorrow. I know that you intend riding into the eastern part of the patent, and I will accompany you, and conduct you to a spot where some of your projects may be realized. We will say no more now, for there are listeners, but a secret has this evening been revealed to me, Duke, that is of much more consequence to your welfare than all your estate united." Marmaduke laughed at the important intelligence, to which in a variety of shapes he was accustomed, and the sheriff, with an air of great dignity, as if pitying his want of faith, proceeded in the business more immediately before them. As the labor of drawing the net had been very great, he directed one party of his men to commence throwing the fish into piles, preparatory to the usual division, while another, under the superintendence of Benjamin, prepared the seine for a second haul. Chapter 23. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 24 of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 24. While from its margin, terrible to tell, 3 sailors with their gallant boatswain fell. Falconer. While the fishermen were employed in making the preparations for an equitable division of the spoil, Elizabeth and her friend strolled a short distance from the group, along the shore of the lake. After reaching a point to which even the brightest of the occasional gleams of the fire did not extend, they turned, and paused a moment, in contemplation of the busy and lively party they had left, and of the obscurity which, like the gloom of oblivion, seemed to envelop the rest of the creation. "This is indeed a subject for the pencil!" exclaimed Elizabeth. "Observe the countenance of that wood chopper, while he exults in presenting a larger fish than common to my cousin Sheriff. And see, Louisa, how handsome and considerate my dear father looks by the light of that fire, where he stands viewing the havoc of the game. He seems melancholy, as if he actually thought that a day of retribution was to follow this hour of abundance and prodigality. Would they not make a picture, Louisa?" "You know that I am ignorant of all such accomplishments, Miss Temple." "Call me by my Christian name," interrupted Elizabeth. "This is not a place, neither is this a scene for forms." "Well, then, if I may venture an opinion," said Louisa timidly, "I should think it might indeed make a picture. The selfish earnestness of that Kirby over his fish would contrast finely with the expression of Mr. Edwards' face. I hardly know what to call it, but it is you know what I would say, dear Elizabeth." "You do me too much credit, Miss Grant," said the heiress. "I am no diviner of thoughts, or interpreter of expressions." There was certainly nothing harsh or even cold in the manner of the speaker, but still it repressed the conversation, and they continued to stroll still farther from the party, retaining each other's arm, but observing a profound silence. Elizabeth, perhaps conscious of the improper phraseology of her last speech, or perhaps excited by the new object that met her gaze, was the first to break the awkward cessation in the discourse, by exclaiming: "Look, Louisa, we are not alone. There are fishermen lighting a fire on the other side of the lake, immediately opposite to us. It must be in front of the cabin of Leatherstocking." Through the obscurity, which prevailed most immediately under the eastern mountain, a small and uncertain light was plainly to be seen, though, as it was occasionally lost to the eye, it seemed struggling for existence. They observed it to move, and sensibly to lower, as it carried down the descent of the bank to the shore. Here, in a very short time, its flame gradually expanded and grew brighter, until it became the size of a man's head, when it continued to shine a steady ball of fire. Such an object, lighted as it were by magic, under the brow of the mountain, and in that retired and unfrequented place, gave double interest to the beauty and singularity of its appearance. It did not at all resemble the large and unsteady light of their own fire, being much more clear and bright, and retaining its size and shape with perfect uniformity. There are moments when the best regulated minds are more or less subjected to the injurious impressions which few have escaped in infancy, and Elizabeth smiled at her own weakness while she remembered the idle tales which were circulated through the village, at the expense of the Leatherstocking. The same ideas seized her companion, and at the same instant, for Louisa pressed nearer to her friend, as she said in a low voice, stealing a timid glance toward the bushes and trees that overhung the bank near them: "Did you ever hear the singular ways of this Natty spoken of, Miss Temple? They say that, in his youth, he was an Indian warrior, or, what is the same thing, a white man leagued with the savages, and it is thought he has been concerned in many of their inroads, in the old wars." "The thing is not at all improbable," returned Elizabeth. "He is not alone in that particular." "No, surely. But is it not strange that he is so cautious with his hut? He never leaves it without fastening it in a remarkable manner, and in several instances, when the children, or even the men of the village, have wished to seek a shelter there from the storms, he has been known to drive them from his door with rudeness and threats. That surely is singular to this country." "It is certainly not very hospitable." "But we must remember his aversion to the customs of civilized life. You heard my father say, a few days since, how kindly he was treated by him on his first visit to his place." Elizabeth paused, and smiled with an expression of peculiar archness, though the darkness hid its meaning from her companion, as she continued: "Besides, he certainly admits the visits of Mr. Edwards, whom we both know to be far from a savage." To this speech Louisa made no reply, but continued gazing on the object which had elicited her remarks. In addition to the bright and circular flame was now to be seen a fainter, though a vivid light, of an equal diameter to the other at the upper end, but which, after extending downward for many feet, gradually tapered to a point at its lower extremity. A dark space was plainly visible between the two, and the new illumination was placed beneath the other, the whole forming an appearance not unlike an inverted note of admiration. It was soon evident that the latter was nothing but the reflection, from the water, of the former, and that the object, whatever it might be, was advancing across, or rather over, the lake, for it seemed to be several feet above its surface, in a direct line with themselves. Its motion was amazingly rapid, the ladies having hardly discovered that it was moving at all, before the waving light of a flame was discerned, losing its regular shape, while it increased in size as it approached. "It appears to be supernatural," whispered Louisa, beginning to retrace her steps toward the party. "It is beautiful!" exclaimed Elizabeth. A brilliant, though waving flame was now plainly visible, gracefully gliding over the lake, and throwing its light on the water in such a manner as to tinge it slightly though in the air. So strong was the contrast, the darkness seemed to have the distinctness of material substances, as if the fire were embedded in a setting of ebony. This appearance, however, gradually wore off, and the rays from the torch struck out and enlightened the atmosphere in front of it, leaving the background in a darkness that was more impenetrable than ever. "Ho, Natty! Is that you?" shouted the sheriff. "Paddle in, old boy, and I'll give you a mess of fish that is fit to place before the governor." The light suddenly changed its direction, and a long and slightly built boat hove up out of the gloom, while the red glare fell on the weather-beaten features of the Leatherstocking, whose tall person was seen erect in the frail vessel, wielding, with the grace of an experienced boatman, a long fishing spear, which he held by its centre, first dropping one end and then the other into the water, to aid in propelling the little canoe of bark, we will not say through, but over the water. At the farther end of the vessel a form was faintly seen, guiding its motions and using a paddle with the ease of one who felt there was no necessity for exertion. The Leatherstocking struck his spear lightly against the short staff which upheld, on a rude grating framed of old hoops of iron, the knots of pine that composed the fuel, and the light, which glared high, for an instant fell on the swarthy features and dark, glancing eyes of Mohegan. The boat glided along the shore until it arrived opposite the fishing ground, when it again changed its direction and moved on to the land, with a motion so graceful, and yet so rapid, that it seemed to possess the power of regulating its own progress. The water in front of the canoe was hardly ruffled by its passage, and no sound betrayed the collision, when the light fabric shot on the gravelly beach for nearly half its length, Natty receding a step or two from its bow, in order to facilitate the landing. "Approach, Mohegan," said Marmaduke. "Approach, Leatherstocking, and load your canoe with bass. It would be a shame to assail the animals with the spear, when such multitudes of victims lie here, that will be lost as food for the want of mouths to consume them." "No, no, Judge," returned Natty, his tall figure stalking over the narrow beach, and ascending to the little grassy bottom where the fish were laid in piles. "I eat of no man's wasty ways. I strike my spear into the eels or the trout when I crave the creature. But I wouldn't be helping to such a sinful kind of fishing for the best rifle that was ever brought out from the old countries. If they had fur, like the beaver, or you could tan their hides like a buck, something might be said in favor of taking them by the thousand with your nets. But as God made them for man's food, and for no other discernible reason, I call it sinful and wasty to catch more than can be eat." "Your reasoning is mine. For once, old hunter, we agree in opinion, and I heartily wish we could make a convert of the sheriff. A net of half the size of this would supply the whole village with fish for a week at one haul." The Leatherstocking did not relish this alliance in sentiment, and he shook his head doubtingly as he answered, "No, no, we are not much of one mind, Judge, or you'd never turn good hunting grounds into stumpy pastures, and you fish and hunt out of rule. But, to me, the flesh is sweeter where the creature has some chance for its life. For that reason, I always use a single ball, even if it be at a bird or a squirrel. Besides, it saves lead; for when a body knows how to shoot, one piece of lead is enough for all, except hard-lived animals." The sheriff heard these opinions with great indignation, and when he completed the last arrangement for the division, by carrying with his own hands a trout of a large size, and placing it on 4 different piles in succession, as his vacillating ideas of justice required, gave vent to his spleen. "A very pretty confederacy, indeed! Judge Temple, the landlord and owner of a township, with Nathaniel Bumppo, a lawless squatter, and professed deer-killer, in order to preserve the game of the county. But, 'Duke, when I fish, I fish. So away, boys, for another haul, and we'll send out wagons and carts in the morning to bring in our prizes." Marmaduke appeared to understand that all opposition to the will of the sheriff would be useless, and he strolled from the fire to the place where the canoe of the hunters lay, whither the ladies and Oliver Edwards had already preceded him. Curiosity induced the females to approach this spot, but it was a different motive that led the youth thither. Elizabeth examined the light, ashen timbers and thin bark covering of the canoe, in admiration of its neat but simple execution, and with wonder that any human being could be so daring as to trust his life in so frail a vessel. But the youth explained to her the buoyant properties of the boat, and its perfect safety when under proper management, adding, in such glowing terms, a description of the manner in which the fish were struck with the spear, that she changed suddenly from an apprehension of the danger of the excursion to a desire to participate in its pleasures. She even ventured a proposition to that effect to her father, laughing at the same time at her own wish, and accusing herself of acting under a woman's caprice. "Say not so, Bess," returned the judge. "I would have you above the idle fears of a silly girl. These canoes are the safest kind of boats to those who have skill and steady nerves. I have crossed the broadest part of the Oneida in one much smaller than this." "And I the Ontary," interrupted the Leatherstocking, "and that with squaws in the canoe, too. But the Delaware women are used to the paddle, and are good hands in a boat of this nature. If the young lady would like to see an old man strike a trout for his breakfast, she is welcome to a seat. John will say the same, seeing that he built the canoe, which was only launched yesterday. For I'm not over curious at such small work as brooms, and basket-making, and other like Indian trades." Natty gave Elizabeth one of his significant laughs, with a kind of nod of the head, when he concluded his invitation, but Mohegan, with the native grace of an Indian, approached, and taking her soft white hand into his own swarthy and wrinkled palm, said, "Come, granddaughter of Miquon, and John will be glad. Trust the Indian. His head is old, though his hand is not steady. The young eagle will go, and see that no harm hurts his sister." "Mr. Edwards," said Elizabeth, blushing slightly, "your friend Mohegan has given a promise for you. Do you redeem the pledge?" "With my life, if necessary, Miss Temple," cried the youth, with fervor. "The sight is worth some little apprehension, for of real danger there is none. I will go with you and Miss Grant, however, to save appearances." "With me!" exclaimed Louisa. "No, not with me, Mr. Edwards. Nor surely do you mean to trust yourself in that slight canoe." "But I shall, for I have no apprehensions any longer," said Elizabeth, stepping into the boat, and taking a seat where the Indian directed. "Mr. Edwards, you may remain, as 3 do seem to be enough for such an egg-shell." "It shall hold a 4th," cried the young man, springing to her side, with a violence that nearly shook the weak fabric of the vessel asunder. "Pardon me, Miss Temple, that I do not permit these venerable Karens to take you to the shades unattended by your genius." "Is it a good or evil spirit?" asked Elizabeth. "Good to you." "And mine," added the maiden, with an air that strangely blended pique with satisfaction. But the motion of the canoe gave rise to new ideas, and fortunately afforded a good excuse to the young man to change the discourse. It appeared to Elizabeth that they glided over the water by magic, so easy and graceful was the manner in which Mohegan guided his little bark. A slight gesture with his spear indicated the way in which Leatherstocking wished to go, and a profound silence was preserved by the whole party, as the precaution necessary to the success of their fishery. At that point of the lake the water shoaled regularly, differing in this particular altogether from those parts where the mountains rose nearly in perpendicular precipices from the beach. There the largest vessels could have lain, with their yards interlocked with the pines, while here a scanty growth of rushes lifted their tops above the lake, gently curling the waters, as their bending heads waved with the passing breath of the night air. It was at the shallow points only that the bass could be found, or the net cast with success. Elizabeth saw thousands of these fish, swimming in shoals along the shallow and warm waters of the shore, for the flaring light of their torch laid bare the mysteries of the lake, as plainly as if the limpid sheet of the Otsego was but another atmosphere. Every instant she expected to see the impending spear of Leatherstocking darting into the thronging hosts that were rushing beneath her, where it would seem that a blow could not go amiss, and where, as her father had already said, the prize that would be obtained was worthy any epicure. But Natty had his peculiar habits, and it would seem his peculiar tastes also. His tall stature, and his erect posture, enabled him to see much farther than those who were seated in the bottom of the canoe, and he turned his head warily in every direction, frequently bending his body forward and straining his vision, as if desirous of penetrating the water that surrounded their boundary of light. At length his anxious scrutiny was rewarded with success, and waving his spear from the shore, he said in a cautious tone, "Send her outside the bass, John. I see a laker there, that has run out of the school. It's seldom one finds such a creature in shallow water, where a spear can touch it." Mohegan gave a wave of assent with his hand, and in the next instant the canoe was without the run of the bass, and in water nearly 20 feet in depth. A few additional knots were laid on the grating, and the light penetrated to the bottom. Elizabeth then saw a fish of unusual size floating above small pieces of logs and sticks. The animal was only distinguishable, at that distance, by a slight but almost imperceptible motion of its fins and tail. The curiosity excited by this unusual exposure of the secrets of the lake seemed to be mutual between the heiress of the land and the lord of these waters, for the salmon trout soon announced his interest by raising his head and body for a few degrees above a horizontal line, and then dropping them again into a horizontal position. "Whist, whist," said Natty in a low voice, on hearing a slight sound made by Elizabeth in bending over the side of the canoe in curiosity. "'Tis a skeary animal, and it's a far stroke for a spear. My handle is but 14 foot, and the creature lies a good 18 from the top of the water, but I'll try him, for he's a 10-pounder." While speaking, the Leatherstocking was poising and directing his weapon. Elizabeth saw the bright polished tines as they slowly and silently entered the water, where the refraction pointed them many degrees from the true direction of the fish, and she thought that the intended victim saw them also, as he seemed to increase the play of his tail and fins, though without moving his station. At the next instant the tall body of Natty bent to the water's edge, and the handle of his spear disappeared in the lake. The long, dark streak of the gliding weapon, and the little bubbling vortex which followed its rapid flight, were easily to be seen. But it was not until the handle shot again into the air by its own reaction, and its master, catching it in his hand, threw its tines uppermost, that Elizabeth was acquainted with the success of the blow. A fish of great size was transfixed by the barbed steel, and was very soon shaken from its impaled situation into the bottom of the canoe. "That will do, John," said Natty, raising his prize by one of his fingers, and exhibiting it before the torch. "I shall not strike another blow to night." The Indian again waved his hand, and replied with the simple and energetic monosyllable of "Good." Elizabeth was awakened by the trance created by this scene, and by gazing in that unusual manner at the bottom of the lake, by the hoarse sounds of Benjamin's voice, and the dashing of oars, as the heavier boat of the seine drawers approached the spot where the canoe lay, dragging after it the folds of the net. Haul off, Master Bumppo," cried Benjamin. "Your top light frightens the fish, who see the net and sheer off soundings. A fish knows as much as a horse, or for that matter more, seeing that it's brought up on the water. Haul off, Master Bumppo, haul off, I say, and give a wide berth to the seine." Mohegan guided their little canoe to a point where the movements of the fishermen could be observed, without interruption to the business, and then suffered it to lie quietly in the water, looking like an imaginary vessel floating in air. There appeared to be much ill humor among the party in the batteau, for the directions of Benjamin were not only frequent, but issued in a voice that partook largely of dissatisfaction. "Pull larboard oar, will you, Master Kirby?" cried the old seaman. "Pull larboard best. It would puzzle the oldest admiral in the British fleet to cast this here net fair with a wake like a corkscrew. Full starboard, boy. Pull starboard oar, with a will." "Harkee, Mr. Pump," said Kirby, ceasing to row, and speaking with sonic spirit, "I'm a man that likes civil language and decent treatment, such as is right twixt man and man. If you want us to go hoy, say so, and hoy I'll go, for the benefit of the company, but I'm not used to being ordered about like dumb cattle." "Who's dumb cattle?" echoed Benjamin, fiercely, turning his forbidding face to the glare of light from the canoe, and exhibiting every feature teeming with the expression of disgust. "If you want to come aft and run the boat round, come and be damned, and pretty steerage you'll make of it. There's but another heave of the net in the stern sheets, and we're clear of the thing. Give way, will ye, and shoot her ahead for a fathom or two, and if you catch me afloat again with such a horse marine as yourself, why, rate me a ship's jackass, that's all." Probably encouraged by the prospect of a speedy termination to his labor, the wood chopper resumed his oar, and under strong excitement gave a stroke that not only cleared the boat of the net, but of the steward at the same instant. Benjamin had stood on the little platform that held the seine, in the stern of the boat, and the violent whirl occasioned by the vigor of the wood chopper's arm completely destroyed his balance. The position of the lights rendered objects in the batteau distinguishable, both from the canoe and the shore, and the heavy fall on the water drew all eyes to the steward, as he lay struggling for a moment in sight. A loud burst of merriment, to which the lungs of Kirby contributed no small part, broke out like a chorus of laughter, and ran along the eastern mountain in echoes, until it died away in distant, mocking mirth among the rocks and woods. The body of the steward was seen slowly to disappear, as was expected, but when the light waves, which had been raised by his fall, began to sink in calmness, and the water finally closed over his head, unbroken and still, a very different feeling pervaded the spectators. "How fare you, Benjamin?" shouted Richard from the shore. "The dumb devil can't swim a stroke!" exclaimed Kirby, rising, and beginning to throw aside his clothes. "Paddle up, Mohegan," cried young Edwards. "The light will show us where he lies, and I will dive for the body." "Oh, save him! For God's sake, save him!" exclaimed Elizabeth, bowing her head on the side of the canoe in horror. A powerful and dexterous sweep of Mohegan's paddles sent the canoe directly over the spot where the steward had fallen, and a loud shout from the Leatherstocking announced that he saw the body. "Steady the boat while I dive!" again cried Edwards. "Gently, lad, gently," said Natty. "I'll spear the creature up in half the time, and no risk to anybody." The form of Benjamin was lying about half-way to the bottom, grasping with both hands some broken rushes. The blood of Elizabeth curdled to her heart as she saw the figure of a fellow creature thus extended under an immense sheet of water, apparently in motion by the undulations of the dying waves, with its face and hands, viewed by that light, and through the medium of the fluid, already colored with hues like death. At the same instant she saw the shining tines of Natty's spear approaching the head of the sufferer, and entwining themselves rapidly and dexterously in the hairs of his queue and the cape of his coat. The body was now raised slowly, looking ghastly and grim as its features turned upward to the light and approached the surface. The arrival of the nostrils of Benjamin into their own atmosphere was announced by a breathing that would have done credit to a porpoise. For a moment Natty held the steward suspended, with his head just above the water, while his eyes slowly opened and stared about him as if he thought that he had reached a new and unexplored country. As all the parties acted and spoke together, much less time was consumed in the occurrence of these events than in their narration. To bring the batteau to the end of the spear, and to raise the form of Benjamin into the boat, and for the whole party to regain the shore, required but a minute. Kirby, aided by Richard, whose anxiety induced him to run into the water to meet his favorite assistant, carried the motionless steward up the bank, and seated him before the fire, while the sheriff proceeded to order the most approved measures then in use for the resuscitation of the drowned. "Run, Billy!" he cried, to the village, and bring up the rum hogshead that lies before the door, in which I am making vinegar. And be quick, boy. Don't stay to empty the vinegar, and stop at Mr. Lacroix's, and buy a paper of tobacco and half a dozen pipes. And ask Remarkable for some salt and one of her flannel petticoats. And ask Dr. Todd to send his lancet, and to come himself. And, Duke, what are you about? Would you strangle a man who is full of water, by giving him rum? Help me to open his hand, that I may pat it." All this time Benjamin sat with his muscles fixed, his mouth shut, and his hands clinching the rushes which he had seized in the confusion of the moment, and which, as he held fast, like a true seaman, had been the means of preventing his body from rising again to the surface. His eyes, however, were open, and stared wildly on the group about the fire, while his lungs were playing like a blacksmith's bellows, as if to compensate themselves for the minute of inaction to which they had been subjected. As he kept his lips compressed, with a most inveterate determination, the air was compelled to pass through his nostrils, and he rather snorted than breathed, and in such a manner that nothing but the excessive agitation of the sheriff could at all justify his precipitous orders. The bottle, applied to the steward's lips by Marmaduke, acted like a charm. His mouth opened instinctively, his hands dropped the rushes, and seized the glass. His eyes raised from their horizontal stare to the heavens, and the whole man was lost for a moment in a new sensation. Unhappily for the propensity of the steward, breath was as necessary after one of these draughts as after his submersion, and the time at length arrived when he was compelled to let go the bottle. "Why, Benjamin," roared the sheriff, "you amaze me, for a man of your experience in drownings to act so foolishly. Just now you were half full of water, and now you are—" "Full of grog," interrupted the steward, his features settling down with amazing flexibility into their natural economy. "But d'ye see, squire, I kept my hatches close, and it's but little water that ever gets into my scuttle-butt. Harkee, Master Kirby, I've followed the salt water for the better part of a man's life, and have seen some navigation on the fresh, but this here matter I will say in your favor, and that is, that you're the awkwardest green 'un that ever straddled a boat's thwart. Them that likes you for a shipmate may sail with you, and no thanks, but damn me if I even walk on the lake shore in your company. For why? You'd as lief drown a man as one of them there fish, not to throw a Christian creature so much as a rope's end when he was adrift, and no life buoy in sight. Natty Bumppo, give us your fist. There's them that says you're an Indian and a scalper, but you've served me a good turn, and you may set me down for a friend, though it would have been more ship-shape like to lower the bight of a rope or running bow-line below me, than to seize an old seaman by his head-lanyard. But I suppose you are used to taking men by the hair, and seeing you did me good instead of harm thereby, why, it's the same thing, do you see?" Marmaduke prevented any reply, and assuming the action of matters with a dignity and discretion that at once silenced all opposition from his cousin, Benjamin was dispatched to the village by land, and the net was hauled to shore in such a manner that the fish for once escaped its meshes with impunity. The division of the spoils was made in the ordinary manner, by placing one of the party with his back to the game, who named the owner of each pile. Bill Kirby stretched his large frame on the grass by the side of the fire as sentinel until morning, over net and fish, and the remainder of the party embarked in the batteau to return to the village. The wood chopper was seen broiling his supper on the coals as they lost sight of the fire, and when the boat approached the shore, the torch of Mohegan's canoe was shining again under the gloom of the eastern mountain. Its motion ceased suddenly. A scattering of brands was in the air, and then all remained dark, as the conjunction of night, forest, and mountain could render the scene. The thoughts of Elizabeth wandered from the youth, who was holding a canopy of shawls over herself and Louisa, to the hunter and the Indian warrior, and she felt an awakening curiosity to visit a hut, where men of such different habits and temperament were drawn together as by common impulse. Chapter 24. Recording by Bill Borst.